My oh my. Hello there. Are you lost? Surely you didn't mean to stumble into my lair? Or perhaps you did. Oh, look at you. So excited to see me. Well, you've come at a perfect time. It's time for the yearly spooky story session. Welcome to the Halloween Storytime reading, but this time, it's in the lair. In a witch's lair. Now, today I have a collection of stories prepared for you all. The only thing is, I hope you won't be too scared. I suppose without further ado we should get started. Now, I think a change in music is in order. The very first story we'll be reading is called Nights of Fear. Sounds like a circus. I actually haven't read these stories myself, so we'll be discovering what it's like together. Alright, let's get started. I usually have to do some explaining when someone finds out that my official title is Head of On-Site Security. Most people assume that the title means that I'm in charge of all the security aspects of the amusement park I'm employed at. That isn't actually the case. The security department is divided into two divisions. The division that I'm the head of, On-Site Security, is the one that is out in the park handling issues that come up, with the majority of the time are caused by the park guests. My team takes care of things such as personal belongings being stolen, breaking up arguments and fights, and removing drunk people from the park. The other division, Operations Security, handles the security issues that are more business-related. Verification of the validity of park passes, loss prevention in the stores and restaurants, monitoring employee activities, those sorts of things. There is surprisingly little overlap between the duties of the two sides of the department. The big exception to this is during the annual Halloween events that are held in the park, specifically those that take place after sundown. This is by far the most difficult time of the year for security, and it requires both divisions to be temporarily combined into one to make sure that there's enough coverage and manpower for the issues that inevitably occur. There's a tricky balance between allowing guests to have a good time during the more adult-oriented event and making sure that they both are and the park itself are safe while they do so. Are we alright? Not nodding off already? Okay, good. Before I go any further, I should mention that I'm bound by a large number of non-disclosure agreements. Ooh, spooky. Breaking those would inevitably lead to a number of lawsuits and possibly criminal prosecution, and I have a family to think about. Because of this, I can't give the name of the amusement park that I work for or mention any real names. There should be enough here to connect the dots, however. What I can say is that, while it's a smaller park than, say, the various Disney and Universal parks, it is large enough that it attracts a high number of visitors each year during the summer season. That number goes down sharply once school starts in the fall. Due to this decline, the park shifts to only being open on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays until it shuts down completely for the winter, beginning the first week of November. Starting in September, the park is given a Halloween-themed makeover. That makeover is kept family-friendly during the daylight operating hours. The various cartoon mascots that wander the park wearing costumes, tents that are set up that children can trick-or-treat at, and decorations that cover pretty much everything. While the water rides are already closed for the season, the water inside them is temporarily dyed orange or green. A maze made of hail bales is constructed near the parkside entrance It really is a good time for both children and their parents. Just before sundown, the park is closed for an hour. Crews work during this time to remove or modify many of the decorations to make the park look and feel more sinister. A small army of actors arrive dressed in macabre costumes. New haunted house attractions are prepared for visitors, and menus at the various restaurants and food stops are changed to include less food and far more alcoholic options. This is the park's annual Nights of Fear promotion. Again, not the actual name, but close enough for you to connect the dots. Open to anyone 18 or over, it is a huge moneymaker that is also a huge pain in the ass for security. The atmosphere is designed to be creepy, as well as rather adult-oriented. The actors that are hired for the season roam the park in designated areas called scare zones, where they jump out at unsuspecting guests and try to look threatening instead of ridiculous. Others work inside of attractions that are basically flashier versions of those haunted houses or haunted walks that pop up around Halloween. Here's how this all breaks down with regards to the incident. You have a security team that has been greatly reduced in size because the park is only open 3 days a week, not to mention one that isn't used to working together because it's been cobbled together from 2 different divisions. The event takes place at night, which is far more difficult to monitor than the activities that take place during the day. There is an influx of temporary employees in the form of the scare actors. The park itself has been decorated, often with large and complex displays that can block cameras and create blind spots. Finally, there's alcohol. Lots and lots of alcohol. It's a difficult situation for everyone behind the scenes. The security staff is stretched thin, and there are inevitably incidents every single night, many of which we don't find about until the next day. To say that it's an all-hands-on-deck situation is putting it mildly. 9 days ago, we had just passed the 11 o'clock mark during one such night. Normally, I patrol the park with the majority of the other security guards during event nights. There's a lot of ground to cover and not many people to do it with. I need to coordinate security while also handling issues personally. It's one of the few things I enjoy about the Nights of Fear event. I get to be outside in the fresh air instead of seated behind my desk in a stuffy office. I just returned to the office to swap out a dead walkie-talkie. We typically use cell phones to communicate, but some of the haunted house attractions don't play well with digital signals, so we carry the walkies as well. I belted on the new unit and turned to go back out the door, but I was stopped when one of the 2 guards watching the security camera feeds called me over. He quickly rewound a clip and played it back for me. It was in black and white, which was typical when the cameras switched themselves over to night vision mode. A small group of people walked by a store that I recognized as one of the gift shops in the back half of the park. There didn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary, and I opened my mouth to say so. I closed it again and frowned as a figure walked into view. It was a person dressed in a costume. It was hard to tell from the position of the camera, but he seemed to be wearing a pumpkin-like mask and was dressed in a long black coat. He was holding either a baseball bat or some kind of long club. I picked up a clipboard that was hanging from a nearby hook and quickly scanned through the contents. It was a complete listing of all the actors and costumes that had been assigned. Each was themed to a particular area of the park, zombie costumes outside of the Ray from the Grave haunted house, werewolf costumes for the pack hunt scare zone, that sort of thing. There was nothing on the list that fit the description of what I was seeing on the video. With an annoyed sigh, I went back out into the park. If it wasn't one of the actors, it was a guest wearing a costume. There were strict rules against that to make sure that everyone knew who was part of the event and who wasn't. During the day, the children were allowed to dress up, but no adults were allowed to wear costumes at any time. Most of the other guards in the park were busy, and the office wasn't far from the place where the camera had recorded the individual. I decided that I'd take care of it myself. It shouldn't take too long, and from that general area of the park, I could easily make my way over to the heavier traffic parts. I radioed for the control room to send a copy of the video over to my phone. If the guest was no longer wearing the mask, I might still be able to track him down based on the clothes he was wearing. As I walked past the entrance to one of the roller coasters, an actor dressed up as a deranged clown stepped out of the shrubs. I nodded at him and pointed at the green glow-in-the-dark lanyard around my neck. He returned the nod and went back into the bushes. All the park staff were wearing the same lanyard. There were variations of the lanyards that guests could purchase if they didn't want to be jump-scared in the various scare zones throughout the park. Those guests were issued glowing orange ones, and the staff wore green. I followed along the path, wrapping around the roller coaster, passing by groups of guests as I went. I looked closely at each person, but I didn't see anyone that matched what I'd seen on the camera feed. Roughly 10 minutes after leaving the office, I arrived at my destination. The store wasn't one of the ones that was open for Nights of Fear. The windows were dark, and a large closed sign hung on the door. I hadn't really expected the costume guest to still be there, and he wasn't. Still, it was a place to start. My cell phone vibrated as it received the camera feed video. I stepped off of the path and into the store doorway so that I was out of the way of the crowd. Digging my phone out of my pocket, I watched the video again. I noticed something that I hadn't the first time. Right before the figure walked out of frame, he turned slightly and walked at an angle that would take him off the main path. I looked in the direction he had gone in. There was a gate in the fence that separated the public from a maintenance area. The gate was closed, but the padlock was lying on the concrete in front of it. I retrieved the lock and examined it closely. It hadn't been unlocked. It had been broken. This was no longer a simple matter of a guest wearing a costume. I pulled the walkie-talkie off my belt and radioed the control room to request backup. One of the most important rules of Nights of Fear, security was to never go into a potentially dangerous situation alone. It took a while for someone to answer, much longer than it should have. When someone finally got back to me, I was informed that a brawl had broken out between two groups of college kids at the other side of the park. Everyone was either committed there or was dealing with one of the smaller issues that were happening. That meant that I had to make a choice. Either I continued my search alone, going against both policy and common sense, or I risked losing the trespasser by waiting for other security guards to become available. Under normal circumstances, I would have gladly opted for the latter instead of the former. The problem was that this wasn't a normal circumstance. The maintenance area that had been broken into went directly under one of the roller coasters. If you weren't familiar with it, the area was safe enough. If you weren't, however, there were multiple places where the coaster track came down to ground level at the bottom of large hills. At the speed they traveled at, the cards could easily injure or kill a person in their path. There's a very good reason that maintenance areas like this one were only to be used when the rides were shut down. Even if the trespasser was able to avoid being struck by the ride, what if he somehow caused damage to the track, or obstructed it in some way? That would endanger the riders. I considered things for a moment before swearing in frustration and radioing the office to have the roller coaster temporarily stopped. I would have to go in, sweep the area to make sure that no one was still there, and lock it back up. There was a time limit as well. A lot of inebriated people would be waiting in line, and for the sake of the park employees operating the ride, it was best to make sure they weren't waiting too long. I waited for a few minutes before I got confirmation from the office that the ride was stopped and that all cars were off the track. At the same time, I watched as the green lights above the roller coaster station turned red. Nodding to myself, I took out my flashlight and proceeded into the maintenance area. It was oddly quiet. Out in the main areas of the park, the guests and rides kept up a consistent high level of noise. The maintenance area was fenced off, which combined with the coaster being shut down, muted much of the cacophony of sounds. It was almost a shock when I realized that I could hear my own footsteps. I'd only been walking for a minute or two when I noticed another sound. It was the sound of metal scraping on concrete. Because of the way it echoed, it was difficult to pin down where it was coming from. I stopped and listened while I got my bearings. Most of the area under the roller coaster was hard compacted dirt rather than concrete. The only places where the sound could be coming from were around the support struts from the ride, which seemed unlikely, or the large poured pad that the maintenance sheds were secured to. There weren't a lot of lights, and the one that were spaced throughout the maintenance area didn't do much. I was used to walking through the park at night alone after the last guest had left. A lot of people would find that unnerving or creepy, but I found it to be relaxing. This was different. I grew more and more nervous with each step, and I started to get jumpy around every shadow. I stopped walking and mentally scolded myself for acting like a child before continuing on. The noise stopped as I came to the sheds. It was replaced by a new sound, a low and almost inaudible whimpering. I hurried forward. Clearly someone was hurt. I came to a 6-foot wide gap between two of the sheds and abruptly halted. I couldn't tell what I was looking at. The space was dark, but I could just make out a large figure standing at the far end with his back turned towards me. Remembering the flashlight that I was holding, I shined the beam forward just in time to see the person raise his arm over his head. The light reflected off something metal in the person's hand as the arm swung downward. It was a thick piece of rebar. The pole struck something that I couldn't see around due to the man's bulk. The whimpering abruptly ceased. I pulled out my taser free from its holster. While security at the park didn't typically carry weapons of any kind, an exception was made during the Nights of Fear events. This was because the crimes that happened during those events tended to be more violent and were sometimes threatening to the guards themselves. I identified myself and ordered the figure to turn around and face me. There was a long pause where nothing happened. I was just about to give the order again when the man slowly did as he was told. I nearly dropped the taser. The man was tall, nearly 7 feet. He was wearing a long black coat that was buttoned up to his neck. and he had the pants and boots to match. His hands were gloved, and in his right hand was the rhubarb pole that I'd caught a glimpse of. All of these details I took in peripherally. My gaze was locked on his head. The security feed had made me think that he was wearing a pumpkin mask. This wasn't the case. His head was shaved, and it was painted with orange and black makeup that made it resemble a warped jack-o'-lantern. His eyes, though, they just weren't there. I don't know how to describe it. Where his eyes should have been were two dark voids that the light from the flashlight couldn't penetrate. I stared at them, not really comprehending what I was looking at. His appearance was so striking that it took me a bit to notice the blood dripping from the rhubarb. I lowered the flashlight slightly so that the beam was focused on the metal. Bits of flesh and hair were stuck to it. I remember the whimpering that had been silenced and tilted my head to look beyond the man. I could barely make out the remains of a person on the ground. The head had been mangled to the point that it was barely recognizable as human. The man started to advance towards me. With every step that he took forward, I took two back. I still had the taser pointed at him, but I doubted it would do any good. Not only was the man massive, but he was also heavily clothed from his neck down. The probes would have a hard time making good connection. I had to try, though, and it needed to be before he got too close. I pointed the taser at his center of mass and fired. The probe sank into his coat, into the chest region, and the electricity began to flow. The man stopped moving and looked down at them. He brushed them with his hand like they were flies, and they came free of the coat and clattered to the ground. With that done, he started to come towards me once more, the rhubarb still clutched in his hand. I hurried back out of the way as he approached, ready to run at any moment. But when he reached the end of the small alley, he simply walked past me without pausing. I stared up at him in confusion as he went by. My walkie-talkie emitted a burst of static. With surprising speed, the man turned, reached out, and pulled it free of my belt. He squeezed his hand and crushed the device flat. The noise ceased. He opened his fingers and let the broken parts fall to the ground before continuing on his way. Taking one last good look at him, I hurried down the short path to the body on the ground. To my surprise, the person was still alive. I wouldn't have thought that anyone could have survived the wounds that they had suffered, but it was clear that wouldn't be the case for much longer. The bludgeoning had been so thorough that it wasn't possible to determine things as gender and age. They were just this lump of blood and flesh. I looked back over my shoulder at the man as he turned and disappeared behind one of the sheds. The amount of strength that this horrible act required was unbelievable. I thought back to his eyes, those black holes with nothing in them, and I shuddered. The remains of the person died a few minutes later. There wasn't anything that I could do for them except make sure that they didn't die alone. Once they were gone, I hurried out of the space between the sheds to try and find the killer, but he was no longer there. With my radio broken, I didn't have much of a choice on how to proceed. I rushed back to the office and called the local police. Over the next few hours, my staff and I looked through the security camera footage as closely as humanely possible. There was no sign of the man, and we couldn't find any video of him leaving the maintenance area. When the police searched it for the rest of the night and in the morning, they came up empty-handed. Everyone was at a loss as to how he had disappeared. Because of what had happened, the local police began to patrol with the security staff every night the park was open. That was 9 days ago. A week after the first killing, we caught sight of the man on the security cameras again. This time, it was in a different part of the park. just outside one of the haunted house attractions. I took 3 other guards with me and rushed over, but he was gone again by the time we got there. Behind the house, pushed up against a dumpster hidden from the view of the guests, was another dead body. Last night was the 3rd killing. The staff watching the cameras didn't see the man initially, but a mutilated corpse was found at the top of a waterfall at one of the water attractions. We reviewed the tapes and we discovered a clip of less than a second where you could see the man walk behind one of the rocks in the attraction. Tonight, a member of my staff and a police officer managed to catch the man in the act. He had dragged a woman in her early 20s behind a carousel by her hair. They got there just as he was about to stab her with a broken bottle. The officer immediately opened fire with his sidearm, and 2 of the shots connected with the target. The man staggered before falling to one knee. The officer put his empty gun back in its holster and took out a pair of handcuffs to arrest him as the security guard radioed in for backup and to have the ride stopped. When he got close, the man suddenly stood back up and grabbed the officer by the throat. He turned to one side and held out the struggling officer out towards the still spinning carousel. One of the horses came racing by and smashed in the side of his head. I could hear the riders screaming all the way from the park entrance. None of this was caught by the cameras. It was relayed to me by the security guard that had witnessed it. The man left him alive for reasons that I don't understand. He did, however, pause long enough to jam the remains of the broken bottle into the woman's chest before disappearing once again into the night. Today is Sunday. The park will be closed for the next 4 days. When Friday comes around again, though, I have to believe that there will be more killings. Before I sat down to write this, I put in a call to the head of operations for the company that owns the amusement park. I'm still trying to process what he had told me. Despite the danger to the guests, the park won't be cancelling the Nights of Fear event. It all comes down to dollars and cents, you see. This is one of the most profitable times of the year for the park, and attendance has actually gone up since the killing started. I don't know if people think that it's just a publicity stunt or if it's simply because it makes it more exciting for them to think they're in the presence of a real serial killer. Whatever the case, the police won't be shutting it down either. The event is good for the local economy, not just the park. The people who make the decisions here in town aren't willing to give up their cash cow. So I'm going to be ordering my staff not to engage with the face-painted man. So far, he hasn't attacked any of us, although I think he was close to doing so when I used my taser on him. We're going to stay out of his way, and hope that the police present at the park will be able to stop him. I'm not willing to needlessly throw away the lives of my people. Someone is stalking the Nights of Fear, and there is not a damn thing any of us can do about it. And that's the first story. Just a little warm-up to get us started. I hope you enjoyed it. yes, a lot of these stories are longer than what we're used to. You enjoyed it. I'm glad. What do we do if we start getting scared? Well, my dear, that's the point. Now, I think it's time for a second story, don't you? Alright, what is the second story that we have? Let me take a look. Yes, alright. The next one is called Nighty Night. Huh. We've got Nights of Fear, now we have Nighty Night. Interesting. Nighty Night. You guys ready? Good. Nighty night. For the past 5 years, it's just been Ian and me. My wife's pregnancy with him wasn't easy. There was a number of scares and close calls due to health issues that she had experienced all her life. Every doctor she'd been to had told her that she would never be able to get pregnant in the first place. She put on a brave face and joked that she would just get an entire litter of puppies instead. But when she was thinking about it, and didn't know I was watching, her real feelings were etched all over her face. She loved kids, and the thought of not being able to have one herself was heartbreaking for her. We discussed other options, of course. Adoption, fostering, you name it, and we looked into it. We even had a meeting scheduled with an adoption agency when a miracle happened. That miracle was Ian. Against all the odds, Ellen became pregnant. Her doctors were at a complete loss. It should have been impossible, but suddenly there we were, talking about converting our second bedroom into a nursery and planning out how to shuffle around our work schedules to make sure that one of us was always home with the baby. The complications began about 4 months into the pregnancy. It seemed like every few weeks we were at the hospital while the staff ran tests or performed procedures. Ellen was amazing during all of it. I was acting like a complete lunatic, worried out of my mind about every little thing. But she would just lay there, in the uncomfortable office bed, stroking her increasingly large belly and smiling to herself. She would tell me that she just knew that everything would work out in the end, and that all the issues were just bumps in the road. She went into labor early, just a few days after the 31-week mark. She waddled into the kitchen and told me in a very calm and very matter-of-fact tone that the baby was coming. I'd been getting ready for bed, so in that same collected manner, she retrieved the bag we had packed weeks earlier and the car keys while I frantically got dressed and grabbed a few necessary items that hadn't gone into the bag yet. 6 hours later, Ian was born. He was so small that I could feel my heart sink as he emerged. The doctor immediately took him over to a radiant warmer table where he and a nurse began working with him. A second nurse kept me from getting too close to ensure that I didn't get in the way. The activity suddenly stopped, and the most wonderful sound filled the room. Our son started to cry. The doctor informed me that due to Ian's size, he would need to spend a couple of weeks in the newborn intensive care unit, but that from what he could see, the child would be fine. I remember feeling so relieved that I had to put my hand on the bed's footboard to steady myself. My fingers had just touched the plastic when the alarm on Ellen's monitor went off. Ian and I lost her in less than an hour. It wasn't anything that the hospital staff did wrong, and it wasn't anything that could have been prevented. The stress of the labor and birth had been too much for her, and she had suffered massive hemorrhaging. The staff did their absolute best to save her, but it just wasn't possible. She never even got to hold Ian before she was gone. I never got a chance to mourn her. I was now a single parent, and all that mattered was that tiny little baby in the NICU. Next few weeks were spent going to work, getting through my shift, and immediately returning to the hospital to sit with Ian all night long before doing it all over again. Shortly before he was released, I secured a position with a new company. It paid less, but it allowed me to work from home. Without much of a family support system, I needed to be there for him at all times. After all, it was just me and him now. I wish so much that Ellen could see this incredible child that we had together. He is loving, energetic, frustrating, confounding, and so much more. He's everything that we could have hoped for, and so much more. He also has a very vivid imagination for his age, which is partly why I didn't believe him when he first told me that he was being visited by something during the night. It took a while to get to this point, but we've settled into a routine each evening. We had dinner together, spent about an hour running around outside if the weather was nice, or playing inside if it isn't. Ian gets his bath, then he lays down to sleep for the night. The routine is supposed to be finished around 8 o'clock each night, but if you have kids, you know that no routine is foolproof. On the first night that he was visited, I didn't manage to get him wrangled into bed until almost 9. I was catching up on work at my desk when I heard Ian yell for me. I'm ashamed to admit that my first reaction was to feel irritated. Normally when he called out, it was trying to get one last drink of water or to tell me that he wasn't tired or couldn't go to sleep. But that would happen at least twice a week. I said that I have an incredible child, not one that was prone to the usual 4-year-old tendencies. When he immediately cried out a second time though, I stood up and pushed my chair back so hard that it tipped over. There was panic in his voice. I hurried up the short flight of stairs to the second floor and flung his door open, my hand immediately going for the light switch. Ian and was sitting in his bed, with tears streaming down his face. The left leg of his pajama pants were pulled up, and his hands were pressed down on the skin. The sheets and comforter from his bed were laying on the floor. His pillow was hanging halfway off the mattress. I hurried over to him and knelt down next to his bed, putting down the safety rail as I did so. He immediately flung his arm around my neck and started crying harder. The sobbing was so intense that he started to cough uncontrollably. I pried him off of me and held him in my lap to allow him to catch his breath. We sat there for a long time, him crying and sniffling loud with me gently stroking his hair and telling him that everything was all right. When he finally calmed down, I sat him on the edge of the bed and took his hand away from his leg. There were 3 long scratches running down it. They weren't deep, but there were a few tiny beads of blood. I gently asked him what had happened. He remained silent. I asked him again, and this time, he lifted his head to look me in the eyes.
Nighty Night hurt me,
he told me in a tiny voice. I looked back at him in confusion. I don't know what I expected him to say, but it certainly hadn't been that. Nighty Night? I asked softly. Like what I tell you at night before you go to sleep?
Nighty Night,
Ian repeated, more forcefully this time.
he scratched me, like the bad cat did.
Just after his 3rd birthday, he had been scratched by a neighbor's kitten while trying to play with it. The claws had even punctured the skin, but the incident had stuck with him. I'm sorry, big guy, I don't understand. Are you saying that Nighty Night is a cat?
No, cat. Nighty Night is a monster, Daddy. He hurt me.
I looked back down at the scratches. They were obviously real, and just as obviously that it hadn't been caused by any monster. Something else had happened. I want to make it clear that I never thought for a second that Ian was lying to me. Sure, he was prone to the occasional fib, just like any young child was, but he never lied to me about important things. Besides, he was too scared to be making up a story. Scooping Ian into my arms, I carried him to the bathroom and got the first aid kit out of the cabinet. As I sat down on the toilet and maneuvered him into my lap, I mentally slapped my forehead. The past few nights I'd forgotten to trim his fingernails when I had given him his bath. He must have scratched himself in his sleep and had woken him up, and his still half asleep mind must have interpreted the whole thing as a monster attacking him. I quickly bandaged the scratches before trimming his nails with a small silver clipper. He had calmed down by that point, and I gave him a hug before carrying him back to his room. When I put him down in his bed, however, he held onto me so tightly that I nearly tipped forward. He absolutely refused to sleep in his bedroom that night. We ended up falling asleep together on the couch downstairs, and by the time the sun was up, he was back to his normal self. The events of the previous night seemed to have been forgotten. It was Saturday, and because I didn't have to work on the weekends, I took Ian to the local state park. We spent the entire day playing on the playground and splashing around in the lake. By the time we had left the park and headed home, we were both exhausted. He fell asleep in his car seat, just a few minutes away from the house. I carried him inside and up to his bed. He remained passed out through the entire process. I planned to let him sleep for an hour or so. He still needed to eat dinner, and I knew that if he napped too long, it would be almost impossible to get him down that night. Kicked off my shoes and flopped down in the chair to enjoy the momentary silence. That silence didn't last long. It was shattered by Ian screaming. It wasn't a yelp or crying out like it had been the previous night. This was a full scream, one filled with pain and terror. I yelled his name as I leapt up the stairs and burst into his room. Ian was sitting on the floor, his thumb in his mouth and his eyes watery. He was rocking back and forth and back and forth. He looked up at me with a blank expression, as if he knew I was there, but my presence didn't mean anything to him. I picked him up, and as I did, I felt something warm and wet on my hand. I pulled it away from his back and saw that there was blood on my fingers. Just as I had the night before, I carried him into the bathroom and turned on the light. I immediately saw his back reflecting off the mirror over the sink, and I felt like ice was poured into my veins. Pieces of his shirt were torn away, and the shreds that remained were red with blood. I sat Ian on the counter and lifted the shirt over his head. He was unresponsive during the entire process, and part of me that was still thinking clearly wondered if he was in shock. On his back were 3 cuts, each of them spaced roughly the same distance as the scratches on his leg. They were much deeper than those though, and they were bleeding freely. I bandaged them as fast as I could before taking him downstairs and back out to the car. The cuts were too much for my basic first aid skills. He needed a doctor. The drive to the hospital was torture. I patted his car seat as much as I could with a blanket to try and take the pressure off of his back, but he started screaming in pain before we even got very far. Knowing full well that it was illegal, I pulled it over, unstrapped him, and set him down in the passenger seat with him facing sideways before getting back in and continuing to drive. Maybe that was the wrong call. I honestly don't know. All that I know is that I couldn't stand for him to be in agony like this. The nurse behind the emergency room desk immediately waved us through the door when she saw Ian's back through the window. She ran off to get a doctor while I carefully sat him down on a nearby gurney. I hugged him as best as I could without touching his back, and told him that everything was going to be okay. I know it hurts, little man, but I have to ask you something, I told him with a reassuring smile. What happened?
Nighty Night.
He replied immediately in a matter-of-fact voice.
Nighty Night hurt me.
I didn't have time to question him further. The doctor arrived and she took one look at Ian's back before telling a nurse to wheel him into a nearby examination room. I went to follow, but the doctor told me that she thought it was best if I waited outside. Her eyes were looking past me as she spoke, and when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw that she was looking at a security guard standing at the far end of the hallway. If I had been thinking straight, I would have understood what was happening, but at the time I was too worried about Ian to figure out what that look meant. The doctor went into the examination room as the nurse came back out. She put her hand on my arm and gently led me away from the door. I protested, of course, but she made it clear that I had to come see her and answer some questions before I was able to see Ian. She started by asking me if there were any pets or animals in the house, to which I replied there weren't. She then asked if we had been with anyone else when his injuries had occurred. When I told her we hadn't, she followed up by inquiring if I had been drinking that day. That was the moment that I started catching on. The hospital staff was trying to determine if I had been the one that hurt my son. At some point during the conversation, a man in a grey suit entered the hallway and came to a stop next to us. He introduced himself as a social worker, and he stated it was his job to make sure that Ian was safe and got the best care possible. He asked his own set of questions and I answered them as best as I could, but I wasn't sure that he was really believing me. It didn't help that I couldn't tell him what had happened because I had no idea myself. Sometime later, the doctor came back out of the room and informed me that while one of the cuts had been shallow enough to bandage, the other two had required stitches. To say that I was irate was an understatement. I wasn't upset that she had done what was medically necessary. I was angry that I'd been kept out of the room the entire time instead of being in there to comfort him during the process. She stood there calmly as I yelled, and once I had said my piece and was winding down, she told me that she was recommending that Ian stay at the hospital overnight for observation. After taking a deep breath, I asked as calmly as I could if I would be able to stay with him. She didn't answer, but the social worker did. He told me in a clearly practiced tone that due to the nature of the injuries, he was going to take Ian into his custody for the night while he worked to determine the nature of the injuries. His tone might have been pleasant and measured, but the implication behind his words were very clear. "You think that I hurt Ian," I said, fighting back a second wave of anger. "I would never hurt my son. If you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you..." "That's enough," the social worker snapped, cutting me off. "You need to stop right there. I haven't made a determination one way or another on if I think you did this. I will say that I've met a lot of abusive fathers in my time, and you don't strike me as one of them. I have policies and protocols that I have to follow. What's best for everyone involved is that you go home for the night, get some sleep, and let me do my job so that we can get this put behind us." He had caught me off guard. I stared at him for a long moment before nodding once. Anything I did other than that what he told me to would only jeopardize my situation. And even though the thought of being apart from Ian for a night made me sick, the thought of him being taken away permanently was much worse. I nodded again, and he patted me on the arm, told me to come back in the morning and to ask for him at the desk before turning to go into the examination room. As he opened the door, I clearly heard Ian call out for me. I left the hospital feeling as if my entire world was burning before my eyes. I went home and immediately marched to Ian's room. I was determined to figure out what had happened to him. The scratches on his leg could have been explained away by him causing them in his sleep. But the cuts on his back were another matter. He couldn't have reached that area of his body. Even if he could have, there's no way he could have made the markings that deep. Something else happened. I tore apart his room looking for answers. A loose screw, a nail that he had leaned up against, a broken piece of bed that I hadn't noticed, a toy with something protruding. Anything. I examined every inch of the room from top to bottom. I came up empty. There was nothing that I could find that could have caused his injuries. Defeated, I leaned up against the wall and slid down the floor. Something caught my eye. I reached over to pick up a small, stuffed duck. Its yellow cloth had faded, and overall it looked a bit worse for wear, but I could still easily identify it as the first toy that Ellen had bought for Ian. It had been right after we had found out that she was pregnant. She had named it Mr. Quackers, an absurd name for an absurd-looking duck. Shuba. The events of the day caught up with me, and I started to nod off. I felt my eyelids growing heavier with every heartbeat. This was good, I reasoned. I would get some sleep, then be at the hospital the moment the sun began to rise. That was when I saw the creature standing in the corner of the room. One moment, there was nothing there, and the next, there it was. Its extremely tall grey body bent over as it pushed up against a ceiling. Its limbs were extremely long and thin for the creature's size. The two arms ended in 3 needle-like fingers that had to have extended for at least 3 feet from the hands. Stretched out on its elongated neck was its face, its lips dry and cracked, and in missing entire chunks in some places, were pulled back in an eternal grin that exposed its oversized white teeth. The lidless eyes were black in the center, and the areas that a person would have had white were the dried yellow color of old parchment. Dark ichor that pooled in its jaw slowly dripped onto the ground as it watched me.
Nighty Night.
The creature rasped out. My entire body jumped as I snapped back to full consciousness. The creature was gone again, with no trace that it ever even been there in the first place. The spots where the ichor had splattered onto the ground had vanished. I sat there on the ground, alone in the room with my pulse racing and my breath coming in short gasps. I could have attempted to rationalize what I had seen. It probably would have been easy enough to convince myself that I imagined it, that it was the trick of the light, that my nearly unconscious mind had twisted into a horrifying vision that was a perfectly rational explanation. The problem was that I had seen it. I knew that it had been real. There was no question about it in my mind. It was impossible. But I was sure that it had been occupying the corner of the room across from me seconds earlier. My breathing slowed, and my panic was slowly replaced by nausea as a realization came over me. Ian had also seen this creature. He had stood over my 4-year-old son with that nightmarish face. He had then proceeded to hurt him not once, but twice. If I was this scared, I couldn't fathom how frightened he had been. Nighty Night. Ian had called it Nighty Night. It must have said the same thing to him that he had said to me. I got off the floor and left the bedroom, closing the door behind me. I stood in the hall for a moment before rushing into the bathroom and throwing up in the toilet. It went on for quite some time, so long that I started to wonder if it would ever stop. When it did, I collapsed against a bathroom, lightheaded and close to passing out. There was a thud from inside Ian's room. I lifted my head as best as I could and looked out through the bathroom doorway. I managed to focus my eyes just in time to see the knob on the bedroom door start to turn. There was an audible click, and the door slowly swung open. Nighty Night's face took up much of the bedroom doorway as it grinned at me. I tried to stand, but I was too weak from throwing up to manage it. I could only watch as Nighty Night pressed its head against the wood frame. It was too large to make it through the opening. My feeling of relief was only momentary. Nighty Night started to push its head harder. Its face stretched back as the head slowly began to force its way through. It was like watching rubber being forced through a hole.
Nighty Night.
It rasped, the voice coming out distorted through the stretched lips. I had to leave, and I had to do so quickly. More of the monster's head was making it through the doorway every second, and it wouldn't be long before it was free of the room's confines. Ignoring my aches and pains, I forced myself into a standing position. My head swam, and once again I was sure I was going to pass out, but somehow I was able to barely remain conscious. Nighty Night's face was almost all the way through the doorway now. I stumbled into the hallway and pressed myself up against the wall opposite from the creature. Being as careful as I could, I moved past it, feeling its hot breath on me as I did so. Its teeth were mere inches away from my body. I made it through the thin opening and hurried down the stairs. My foot caught on the last step. It wasn't enough to make me lose my balance entirely, but it did trip me up, and I stumbled forward before falling over the side of the couch. My head struck one of the armrests. I must have blacked out. I don't remember doing so, but the next thing I knew, I was being awoken by the sound of knocking. I sat up on the couch and immediately regretted doing so, as the worst headache I'd ever had greeted me. The knocking continued. It took me a few seconds to figure out that someone was banging on the front door. I stood up and took 2 steps towards the door before I remembered what had happened. I looked up the stairs, expecting to see Nighty Night squeezing its way down the hallway towards me, but the creature was gone. Still a bit dazed and not sure what else to do, I continued over to the front door and opened it. Standing on the other side was a large man in a police uniform. He was holding a clipboard under his arm and a pen in one hand. He nodded at me, but didn't smile. He asked me my name and I gave it to him. He informed me that he was here at the request of the social worker from the hospital, and that he would like to inspect my son's room. I moved aside and let him into the house. I closed the door behind him and led him up the stairs. I didn't want to go anywhere near the second floor after what I experienced, but if I didn't comply with his request, it would undoubtedly impact my chances of getting Ian back as soon as possible. I took him to the still opened bedroom door and we went inside. 99 wasn't there, of course. The officer took the clipboard out from under his arm and asked me a few questions. And I answered them as best as I could. He scribbled some notes onto the paper as I spoke. Seemingly satisfied with my responses, he then got down on one knee and examined the safety rail that ran along the sides of Ian's bed. Have you done anything in this room since you brought your son into the hospital? The officer asked. I tried looking around to figure out what had happened, I told him. Okay, but did you change the bed sheets or anything like that? What? No, I just moved things around and put them back. I didn't change the sheets. The officer nodded. Well, looks like Mr. Eaton was right. Mr. Eaton? The social worker assigned to your son. See here, there's no blood on the sheets, but there are 3 streaks along the safety rail. They match up to where the poles are on the rail. Mr. Eden thinks that your son tried to get out of bed while he was still out of it and slid over the rail. He must have caught the poles just right through the fabric and they dug into him. Cute kid, by the way. He said that he was going nighty-night and that his back started feeling ouchy when he got out of bed. Eden put things together from there. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The theory was wrong, and Ian's words had been completely misinterpreted. The blood trails and the spacing of the rail poles were pure coincidence. It was all working completely in my favor, though. Good thing, too, he continued. If he hadn't figured it out, or if I'd found anything to prove him wrong here, we'd be having a very different conversation right now. Seemingly satisfied with everything, the officer left and went back to his car. I watched him through the window as he pulled out and headed down the street. The sun was starting to come up over the trees, and I could hear the family of robins in the front yard tree chirping. I decided that it was close enough to morning to go to the hospital and get my son back. It went smoother than I had expected. The social worker had me fill out some quick paperwork so that they had my statements for the record, and after that he led me to a patient room on the other side of the hospital. He had barely opened the door for me when Ian came running up to me barefooted with his little hospital gown waving behind him and practically jumped into my arms. He hugged me tightly, and being very careful to avoid the white bandages covering his stitched cuts, I hugged him back. We stood there for what seemed an eternity, me crying and him telling me all about his stay in the hospital. That was 2 months ago. The house that I raised Ian in is currently for sale, and that my realtor tells me that there are a number of people interested even though it hasn't been listed very long. A seller's market, she calls it. I've only been back twice since that night, once to pick up our clothes and other necessary items, and once to pack the remainder of our belongings and put them into storage. Both times were during the middle of the day, and each time I made arrangements for Ian to stay with someone instead of accompanying me. We've been living at a hotel on the other side of town. My long-term plan is for us to move away, far, far away, possibly all the way to the coast. Maybe Hawaii. I don't know. I want to put as much distance between us and this place as possible. Last week, I read a newspaper article in the local paper about an officer that killed his wife. According to the report, he had said that he had just started to doze off one night when a giant monster appeared in his room. He had grabbed the gun and that he kept in his nightstand and fired off 5 shots at it. The monster disappeared, but his wife had been walking into the room at the same time, and 2 of the bullets struck her, killing her almost instantly. No one believed him, of course. How could they possibly have? It was a ludicrous story. He seemed so convinced that he was telling the truth that a psychological evaluation was ordered before formal charges were filed. 3 days later, he was found dead in his cell. Not just dead, but damn near decapitated. The police were baffled. He was alone in his cell, and there was nothing he could have used to do that to himself. The guards think that one of the other prisoners got in and did the job. Former cops don't have a lot of friends in jail after all. They're at a loss to explain just how a prisoner could have gotten into the cell and caused so much damage without alerting anyone. This was the same officer that had come to my house. I know what happened to him. It was the same thing that almost happened to both myself and my son. It was Nighty Night. I think that I've got the creature's appearing and disappearing act figured out. I was on the verge of becoming unconscious both times that I saw it. The first time, I was almost asleep. The second time, I was trying not to pass out. When I did actually black out, it didn't harm me. The officer said in his statement that he was falling asleep when he saw the monster in his room. I think Nighty Night exists in that ever so brief moment between awake and asleep. When you enter into that moment, you can see it, and it can look right back at you. Or maybe I'm wrong, and it's always there, watching and waiting until it can come for you in that short time where your world and its world are connected. I don't know. I don't have all the answers, and I doubt that I ever will. Knowing exactly what Ian had gone through might prove more insight, but it doesn't matter. I refuse to ask him about it. He's sleeping through the night now that his wounds have mostly healed, and I'm not going to dredge up bad memories that could only hurt him. He deserves to be safe and protected from things both natural and unnatural. He'd been through enough already. I'm afraid that he's going to be through more before this is all over. Last night, as I watched him sleeping on the bed in our hotel room, I started to drift off in the uncomfortable chair in the corner of the room. I was just about out when I heard something through the glass window to my right. It was faint, as if coming from quite a distance away, but I recognized it immediately. The raspy voice called out in the darkness. I jerked awake immediately and stood up to start packing our things, being careful not to wake Ian up as I did so. He needed his rest. We were going to be on the road for a very long, long time. How was that one? Was that one good? Ah. Did you like the little Hawaii line that I added in? Honestly, more people should go to Hawaii. Now, hold on just a moment. I need to go check on a few little things. Don't touch anything. Unless you're prepared for what the consequences. No touching anything. Understood? Looks like someone's not good at following instructions. I said not to touch anything. You might want to put that book down if you know what's good for you. Mustn't let your guard down in a witch's lair. Now, we still have quite a few more stories. Which one shall we do next? Are we going to overlap the premiere? You are right. If you haven't heard, there is a premiere happening. Yes, I saw it on the news. We might. But it's just a video. I'm sure you can catch up on it after, don't you? Alright, let's continue. This one is called Beware the Wendigo. Wendigo, interesting name. I'm having a lot of fun. I haven't read any of these stories. They're quite chilling, aren't they? All right, let us begin. This story begins, funnily enough, with a word that I have never seen before. Algonquin? I'm sorry if I pronounced it wrong. Legend says that the Wendigo was once a man like you and me, poisoned by greed and gluttony. The man turned into a pale, gaunt creature with sunken eyes, reaching limbs, and an insatiable hunger for human flesh. Always hungry, the Wendigo searched constantly for its next meal. The truth, however, is much worse. My name is Charles Keeper, and I was an investigative reporter for a local paper in Wisconsin. If that sounds impressive, then you have the completely wrong idea about my career. Mostly, they sent me out in the middle of nowhere to investigate supernatural events and creatures. Half of the people I talked to were pulling their bullshit stories out of their ass, and the other half were hopelessly deluded. Not an exactly perfect job, but hey, whatever puts food on the table, right? My last investigation brought me to a small town nestled deep in the northern forests of Wisconsin. So the curious among you do not seek out this town. I will omit its name. Trust me, it's for your own good. In any case, the remote settlement made a small buzz after a young man living with his mother reported 2 grisly murders. One he committed himself, and the other he claimed was the work of the Wendigo. The man, who I shall simply call Robert, told authorities he heard a screamer hunting one evening. Following the sound down one game trail, he found his neighbor half-eaten while a skeletal white creature stood over him covered in blood and gore. Robert shot several rounds into the creature, then burned its body. The body of the Wendigo was later identified as that of a man who had gone missing almost 15 years prior. Robert never stood trial. To get a closer look at the full story, I first met Robert at his home. I realized it might not be the smartest idea to visit a confessed murderer on his own property. However, I made certain his mother would join us. Even a crazed killer would not hurt an innocent reporter in front of his mother. Or so I told myself. Their home was a shack, battered and broken by time. Dust fogged the windows and weeds strangled the rickety porch. The front door, where Robert waited eagerly for me, hung at an angle and swung to even the gentlest breeze. "You're here," Robert said. He sounded surprised, but pleasantly so. His lips curled into a white, yellow-toothed smile and then faltered, falling into a gloomy frown. We shook hands and headed into the living room to talk. The room smelled of spilled beer and old deli meat. Robert invited me to sit on the couch, no doubt the source of the dizzying stench. I didn't plan to stay very long. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," I said. "I know what you went through must have been difficult, so I won't pry too deep. But please, if you would, recount that day for me in as much detail as you're comfortable with. Our readers are eager to hear the truth." Robert shrugged. "Ain't nothing. People deserve the truth, even if it's hard to hear." I couldn't agree more, I said. I forced a smile. "Truth be told, I'm just happy someone wants to hear my story," he said. "The newspapers, you read them? They're making me out as some lunatic killer." "Well, I work for a newspaper," I said. "But we're dedicated to all sides of the story. That includes your side. So, whenever you're ready." I pulled out a notebook and pen. Scratching his head, Robert glanced up and to the side. His brows scrunched together as he struggled to recall his story. Real or fake, I didn't know, nor care. After some time, Robert shrugged again. Nothing special about that day, he said. I went out hunting. There were some game trails back through the woodsheds there. Didn't find nothing, of course, and night came all quick-like, so I was just heading home. And that's when you found your neighbor and the... He nodded. Wasn't 3 yards from the backyard, if you can believe it. I couldn't. At first, I didn't see nothing. Like I said, night came all quick-like. Clouds across the sky, not a moon or star to see. But I heard it. He made an unsettling sound, like a dog gnawing on a bone. Then down the path, I shine my flashlight and I see it. And Kev is your neighbor? He nodded. And the creature, the Wendigo, he corrected. Ah, yes, the Wendigo. What did it look like? I asked. It was tall, with long white limbs. Its skin was stretched thin as if it didn't fit its bones. And its eyes, they were sunken in, like big black pits. They were cold, dead, nothing there but hunger and hate. His brows pinched together, and his mouth fell open. Blood too. Blood everywhere. On its arms, on its face, on its chest, and... There Kev is. He cleared his throat and muttered something under his breath I didn't catch. God bless him. He was just torn to shreds, and that beast, the Wendigo, still had bits of him in his teeth. Well, I got my Ruger and I pumped 5 shots in it. No hesitation. You and Kev were... close? Good guy. We hunted together on occasions. Ma said he went looking for me in the evening and wanted to ask me something. Now I'll never know what. He stared into the distance and said nothing. I was beginning to wonder where his mother was. So far she hadn't made an appearance, and the longer the silence lingered, the more uncomfortable I felt. Eventually I made a curt cough. And the 5 shots. Did they kill the creature? Seemed so. Howled something awful and fell to the ground, Robert said. But I don't take no chances. I knew what it was as soon as I saw it, and I know the legends. Only fire can kill a Wendigo. So I ran back home, got some gasoline, and lit that fucker up. His face spread into a proud smile. The police identified the Wendigo as... Yeah, I know. But I didn't know him, Robert interrupted. You think it was this man or something else? I asked. Robert shrugged. Could be. They say the Wendigo used to be human. A small, shriveled woman shuffled into the living room. Ain't no human, she said in a harsh, competitive tone. Ma, Robert said. I told you before, she said. Wendigo just means evil spirit. It ain't no human. I told you before, Robbie. You think it's a spirit? I asked his mother. I do, she said. You know, not many people have gone missing over the past 50 years. 5! Christ! We've only had 100 people in this town. Something ain't right with that forest. It ain't natural. You want my advice? Don't go near it. Funny you should say that. I was just about to ask if you'd show me where you found the Wendigo. I can show you where the game trail starts, Robert said, but even I won't go down that way again. You're not thinking of looking around, are you? His eyes twinkled with genuine concern. Robert may have been a murderer, but I could tell he truly believed the story he told me. I pitied him. You already killed the Wendigo. What do I have to fear? I said. The wrinkled old woman scowled.
Don't go looking for trouble,
She said.
'cause you'll find it and you'll be sorry.
A good reporter would follow up on the story with the police. If Robert's mother was right, the town had too many missing persons that could be explained. But I'm not a good reporter. I wanted to go home. Didn't matter where or not I got to the bottom of the story. My readers would still eat up the garbage anyway. So I went out into the woods looking for more Wendigos. One night in the forest and I'd call the story finished. It's not like I expected to find anything. The forest was a forest. Once you've seen one, you've seen them all. Dead brown leaves blanketed the floor while reaching black branches blinded the sky, and though the woods ran a winding dirt path where Robert used to hunt. After walking up and down the trail for an hour, a starless, moonless night had cast everything into shadow. So I made camp for the night. I set up a tent, lit a small fire to keep me warm, and once the flames grew tall and bright, I pulled out my notebook. Late in the evening, I heard strange noises. I wrote. Rustling trees, muffled chatter, a shadow shifted amongst the silhouetted trees. Could have been a person or an animal, but the hair on my neck stood straight up. I didn't feel safe. None of it was true. I hadn't experienced anything outside of the forest's usual sights and sounds. The fire cracked. I sighed. I was tired of spending nights alone in the forest, making up stories about fictional creatures. There are much better ways to spend one's time and make one's money. I was still young. Maybe I could switch newspapers and write something real for a change. I heard another crack. Then another. This time they hadn't come from the fire. I squinted into the dark forest. It had to be some kind of animal. All sorts came out at night to forage. Possums, raccoons, skunks, and so on. But as I searched into the woods, I saw the branches bend and snap. The animal was large. A coyote, perhaps? What else could it be? Leaves rustled. The sound was close. Whatever it was approaching the fire. I looked long and hard for the source of the noise, and I saw an inky shadow passing from tree to tree. Robert? I asked the dark figure. Is that you? There was no answer. Robert? Nothing. Now I was growing afraid. Against all logic, I entertained the possibility that maybe Robert and his mother were right. Maybe there were such things as Wendigos and evil spirits. God, I hoped not. Just in case, I grabbed a log and lit one end in fire. Robert said only fire could kill a Wendigo. It was probably bullshit, but, better safe than sorry. Before long, the noises stopped. I waited and listened with the flaming log in my hand. Minutes passed, one after another, but the forest was silent. After several bated breaths, I relaxed. The campfire, which I had all but forgotten about, had burned down to its last embers. The dark coals smoldered faintly. So I placed my makeshift weapon on top and tried to coax the fire back to life. Just then, I heard the crunch of leaves close behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Only my tent, trembling slightly to a cool breeze. I built the fire into a great blaze, whose heat and light gave me strength. For hours I watched the flames dance and listened for any noise, big or small. Thankfully, I heard nothing, and by the time the fire finally died, I was exhausted, but calm. With my fears behind me, I headed into my tent to rest. It was then I saw it for the very first time. The Wendigo. Its face, not at all human, was a pallid skull adorned with gnarled black antlers. To fit inside the tent, the towering creature hunched over its limbs, but its body was not pale or emaciated as Robert had described. At one look, it was solid black flesh with muscles wide and bulging, and at the next, it was a gossamer fog. However, I didn't get to look too long before it knocked me out cold with a swipe to the head. I woke up in a dingy cave with a raging headache and a chill running down my spine. I was naked, bound to a rock slab, and utterly terrified. Beside me were two other slabs, each with a pale, naked body on them. Even in the dark, I could see the curve of their bones pressing so tight against their skin, I thought it might burst. They were dead. They had to be. Yet when I called out for help, the two bodies stirred suddenly as if waking from sleep. You're alive? Oh, thank God, I said. Where are we? How long have you been here? What's happening? For all my questions, I only received anxious grunts and groans in response. The two people craned their necks to look at me. When I saw their faces, I shrieked in horror. They weren't people. Not anymore. Their eyes had receded into their skull and their teeth had narrowed to beastly points. Bloody sores spotted their hairless scalps and scars marked their gored cheeks. When they looked at me, they gnashed their teeth and licked their tattered lips. I had no doubts. Robert had seen one of these creatures. But why were they tied up? And what was the creature I saw in my tent? I didn't know. All three stone slabs faced a long, gaping tunnel that stabbed deep into the hillside, far from the touch of light. I strained to see its end, yet I could see nothing. And as I looked deeper into the tunnel, I saw a white skull and black antlers emerge silently. Hey! Hey! I said. Who are you? What do you want? The creature eyed me with a hollow stare and then sank back into the darkness. My heart raced in my chest as I struggled against the restraints, but they would not budge. I felt around for something to help me escape, but the ropes pressed down on my wrists. I could only reach fruitlessly with the tips of my fingers. No, 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 I muttered in a shrill, frantic voice. No, please, help me, help! My breaths grew short and shallow until my lungs trembled. No matter how hard I gasped, I couldn't get enough air. Soon my vision spun and went black. When I next woke up, I found my captor seated on a rock. Though it had no eyes to blink, the creature was staring at me. "What do you want?" I asked. It cocked its head to one side but said nothing. "You aren't human. What are you? Ghost? A spirit?" The creature grumbled low in its throat. "A spirit? Is that it?" The creature murmured in a deep, guttural voice. Whatever words it spoke, it was no language I'd heard before. A demon? A Wendigo or something? It said in a menacing tone. The Wendigo stood and approached me. It lowered its hand towards my bare chest and then growled. Then pulled its hand back. The Wendigo turned and walked towards the next captive. The pale beast on the table was already squirming with anticipation. "What do you want?" I asked again. The creature spoke several words in a foreign tongue. "I don't understand," I said. It said as it scanned the captive's willowy body. I had no idea what that meant, but I didn't like the sound of it. I hurled another barrage of questions at the Wendigo, but this time, it ignored me. From out of thin air, the Wendigo produced a long, steel knife. Without hesitation, he pressed the keen blade against the captive's sickly white skin. The beast wailed in pain as the Wendigo shaved off a sliver of skin. But when the deed was done, the bony creature raised its head, mouth agape. It stretched towards the slice of flesh like a flower to the sun. Then, chanting, the Wendigo fed its prisoner. In an instant, the meager strip of skin was gone, consumed without second thought. But the chants continued for several moments more. And when they finally ended, the pale beast began to whimper. It shrank in on itself and trembled visibly. Delighting in its fear, the Wendigo chuckled. Then, after a long, disturbingly silent moment, the Wendigo thrust its hands into the beast's stomach. Soon the cave filled with the victim's shrieks of horror and pain and the Wendigo's moans of pleasure. I closed my eyes, too scared to watch. Several minutes passed before the screams finally died down. I cracked open my eyes and somehow the pale creature's stomach was untouched. Even so, it continued to writhe on the slab, traumatized and in agony. As for the Wendigo, it had moved on to the next victim. Cruel laughter rumbled low in the cave, accented by the shrill of whimpers from the imprisoned. The ritual was about to begin again. I heard the cry of steel and of pain and of pleasure, organs squished and groaned, blood sloshed and spilled. All the while I wondered when it would be my turn to suffer under the Wendigo's touch. However, when the Wendigo finished, it merely turned and disappeared down the tunnel. It was not yet my time. Time, they say, is relative. And in that cave, with no light to signal the day, it could have been days, weeks, or even months that I stayed strapped to that stone. Hunger gnawed at my belly, aching worse than anything I'd ever felt before. At times I caught the Wendigo watching me from the shadows as if waiting for something, and he didn't say or do anything. He continued to torture the other prisoners, but not me. After that, he turned to the tunnel and disappeared for hours on end. With the Wendigo gone, I searched for some way to free myself, but I could think of nothing. One day I heard the wind howl from somewhere behind me. Another day I heard rain patter gently against stone. The exit couldn't have been too far away, but still too far away from reach. In time, the pain of starvation became so unbearable that I could only think of food. I even chewed off the dried flakes of my lips in a desperate attempt to fill my belly, but it didn't even touch my hunger. God, I would have eaten anything if you put it in front of me. Of course, this was exactly what the Wendigo was waiting for. Food must starve, he had said. Didn't take long to figure out what that meant. I had watched the Wendigo long enough to know it wasn't torturing the other prisoners. It was feeding off their pain, their starvation, their hunger. When the Wendigo stood before me one day, I knew it was time. I had starved enough. My heart quaked when I felt the Wendigo's short steel blade, but I suffered the pain with pride. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. The Wendigo had not broken me yet, and when my flesh was forced into my mouth, I spit it back out at the cruel spirit. However, the Wendigo didn't care. It hacked off another chunk of meat, grabbed my jaw in a firm grip, and shoved the flesh down my throat. As I swallowed my pride and flesh both, the Wendigo muttered in its demonic tongue. The words meant nothing to me. Even so, I felt a strange sensation seep into my veins, as if my achy, unrelenting hunger had expanded out of my stomach and into the rest of my body. While I pondered what was happening to me, the Wendigo forced its hands into my abdomen. Its fingers throbbed as they wrapped around my stomach, twisting it and tearing it open. My entrails surrendered to the Wendigo, bursting under its strong grip. The pain was unimaginable. I roared in agony while the Wendigo moaned in delight. No man or woman should have to endure what I did. Worse than the pain and the Wendigo's pleasure was the knowledge I could do nothing to stop it. I was helpless. Not just then, but for years. I thought I would grow accustomed to the torture, resign myself to it. But pain is a funny thing. When you feel it intense enough and often enough, you don't grow numb to it. You grow more sensitive. It traumatizes you. Every moment of every day you fear it, scared and helpless. That's what I was for so many years. Now, you may be wondering how I survived so long, just meager scrapes carved from my body. The Wendigo did something to me and the others. Call it a spell or a curse or whatever you want. But I survived. I survived. And I starved so the Wendigo could feed for years to come. What the creature did, it changed me. Slowly, almost without notice, I became like the other prisoners. My hair fell out, my eyes sank into my skull, and my skin drained of all color. Even my thoughts had started to disappear, consumed by an irresistible, insatiable hunger. I could only cling desperately to my humanity. I forced myself to recall my favorite songs, my hobbies, my family's faces, but it was all fading so fast. Soon, I knew. Soon, there would be nothing. What's more, I heard things. Deep within the lightless tunnel, thin, ghostly voices murmured and growled. I caught only the echo of their words, but it was enough to convince me I'd truly gone mad. Regardless, I did escape that cave eventually. That fateful day began not with my freedom, however, but with the freedom of another. Some time after feeding, when the Wendigo had returned to its tunnel, one of the prisoners rose from its slab. With a jagged rock in one hand, it walked to the center of the cave, looked at the path behind me, where a soft wind murmured. I could barely believe it. Of course, it was possible. After all, Robert had seen and killed one of these creatures. But how many years had I been there? How many years had it been there? If there was hope for that poor beast, then maybe there was hope for me. Maybe it would even let me go. As the pale creature walked past the exit, I opened my mouth to call for its attention. Nothing came out but a dry croak. After all those years without speech, my body barely remembered how to do it. I poured all my strength into my throat and tried again. Please, was all I could muster. It was enough. The creature turned around and approached my slab. Some humanity lingered in the beast after all. It understood me. It pitied me. It would help me. Or so I thought. Still clutching the pointed rock, it looked down at me. For once, I could see its eyes clearly. They were utterly black. Its pupils had expanded until they consumed the entire cornea. Inside, I could see nothing. No thought, no emotion, only hunger. Mouth ajar, the beast grabbed my arm and lifted the rock. All I could do was scream. Then, appearing suddenly, the Wendigo caught the creature's wrist. Without a word, the Wendigo dragged its prisoner back to the slab. Desperate to escape, the creature thrashed at its captor. It clawed and scraped and bit, though to no avail. The Wendigo took the abuse without complaint. In a last-ditch effort to free itself, the creature grabbed one of the Wendigo's antlers and pulled with all its might. A short, twisted chunk snapped off, making the Wendigo howl in pain. For an instant, the creature was free. However, it was only managed to take a step before the Wendigo returned to its senses. With the back of its hand, the Wendigo struck its prisoner across the face. Keen, crooked teeth sprayed across the cave. They tinged against the cold stone like death bells ringing. Fueled by rage, the Wendigo thrust its hand through the creature's chest. Blood splattered over the prisoner beside me, who licked up the hot liquid without remorse. Now one prisoner short, the Wendigo sighed and muttered something in its ancient tongue. Then it grabbed the bloody corpse and dragged it into the tunnel. Halfway down, before disappearing from sight, the Wendigo stopped and looked back at me. A shiver ran down my spine. I clutched my fists tightly. In one of them was a tooth that fell like a miracle into my hand. I prayed to any god that would listen not to let that miracle be taken away, and perhaps one of them heard me, because the Wendigo turned around and sank into the darkness. Uncertain how long the Wendigo's absence would last, I waited. The tooth would be my key home, but I had to be smart. As I expected, the Wendigo returned shortly. It would not let a slab sit empty, so it slipped past me into the free world, where it would soon find another victim. After a few anxious minutes, I began my work. The tooth I received was a molar. It wasn't sharp enough to cut a rope, so I honed it against the stone slab. It took hours to narrow the tooth to a razor-like point, and just as I began to saw through my rope binds, I heard the rustle of cloth against the cave floor. It was the Wendigo, dragging its prey. This time, it was a girl, blonde, in her mid-20s, I guessed. The Wendigo laid her against the slab and disrobed her. She was pretty. At one time, I may have looked at her with pleasure and desire, but at the time, all I could think of was how hungry I was. I held onto the sharpened tooth for another week or so, hiding it when necessary. Truth be told, I was too terrified to free myself. If I got caught, that was it. No more miracles. I would be stuck in that cave forever. I needed a distraction. One day, as the Wendigo carved a sliver of flesh from my thigh, a thin beam of light penetrated our chamber. The light was weak, as if it had come from somewhere far off, but it might as well have been the noontime sun. I hadn't seen light in decades. Although the light flickered and slipped away, the sound of footsteps echoed through the cave. As soon as it heard its sound, the Wendigo dropped its knife and vanished into the tunnel. What it feared, I couldn't say. Your guess is as good as mine, but it was an opportunity and I took it. I frantically dug the tooth into my rope binds. Not long after the footsteps, I heard the voices of 3 men calling out for someone. I didn't know the girl's name, but I could only assume they were looking for her. The ray of light flashed our way again, this time wider and stronger. I glanced at the girl. She struggled against her own binds, but to no avail. Her lips moved, but no words came out. Starvation had drained all of her energy. She was helpless, just as I'd been so many times before. But not this time. This time, I would be free. I hacked through my restraints even as the men's voices faded along with the thin shifting light. Knees wobbly, I pushed myself to my feet. I gave one last look at the depthless black tunnel and left as quickly as my legs would allow. I pushed myself to my feet. The whole time, I wondered if the Wendigo would drag me back to the slab or kill me as it did with the other prisoner. However, luck shone on me that day. After several minutes of ragged breath and throbbing anxiety, I stumbled through the mouth of the cave into freedom. For a man that had not seen light in years, the moon and stars were blinding. And though I shielded my eyes from them, their presence gave me hope and comfort. Gaunt and naked, I ran through the woods in search of civilization. At some point, I collapsed from exhaustion, but when I woke again, I returned to running, bound by fear and hunger. It was midday when I found a dirt path that wove between the trees. I followed it until I came into contact with a young man on a hike. Naturally, his first response was to scream. "Please," I said. It was the one word I knew I could say. And this time the hiker responded with kindness and concern. Despite the horrific transformation I'd undergone, he could still tell I was a person. Not just that, I was starving and covered in cuts and scars. "I'm sorry," the man said. "Do you need help? How can I help you?" I took a step closer. The man's cheeks were full and red with life, and along his neck ran a plump, juicy vein. I tried to speak, but this time only a hoarse grumble came out. "Water? Do you need water?" the man asked. He pulled out a plastic bottle from the bag strapped to his back. "Food," I said. I took another step closer. My heart roared in my ears, or perhaps it was his heart I heard, beating strong from his thick, meaty chest. A shiver ran down my spine. The man pulled a granola bar out of his backpack. "Here." I reached forward to take it. But I didn't want granola. And I couldn't stop myself. I tried. I swear I did. Even with the Wendigo far behind me, its influence lingered. I swatted away the granola bar and leapt at the man, scratching him across the neck. Blood coated my nails, and when I licked the dark drops, they tasted sweet as cream. Unbeknownst to me, the man had a knife. He stabbed it into my shoulder and cut me across the cheek. The pain was no worse than what I'd felt every day in that cave, but I didn't want to suffer anymore. I let go of the man and retreated into a fetal position. Meanwhile, the man ran to the cops, I presume, because sooner or later a group of police officers approached me with guns drawn. Not long after, I found myself in a cell, imprisoned again. At least this time I was clothed and fed. Of course, the police had questions, simple ones. For instance, who are you? It took me a second, but I remembered. Charles Keeper, I said. They ran the name through their database and they came back with a photo. It was a photo of me. I looked so different. I barely recognized myself, yet it was enough for the cops. Jesus Christ, one of them said. You've been missing for 15 years. 15? I repeated. It felt like 50. What happened to you? They asked. Their eyes studied me closely, not once letting up or looking away. I cowered into my knees. I said nothing. When the silence dragged on too long, they held up another photo. Do you know this girl? It was the girl from the cave. I flinched at the sight of her. You do, don't you? I looked up. It hurt to meet their gaze, but I met it anyway. Please, I said. I didn't want to think about her. I didn't want to think about the Wendigo. Please don't. I can't. Can't what? One cop asked. By the color of his face and the volume of his voice, I could tell he was angry. She's been missing a week. Her parents are worried sick. They want to know what happened to their baby, and you can't tell us? You won't. You won't. I stuttered. We won't believe you, another cop finished. I nodded. Go on. Try us. If you tell us where she is, maybe we'll forget about the man you assaulted in the forest, another cop added. I had no choice. They wouldn't let me leave until I told them, so I did. I told them everything. At times I caught them looking among each other, thinking no doubt that I'd gone mad. But on the whole, they were receptive. They tried to make reason of my story. Maybe the Wendigo was just a man in a costume. Maybe the trauma of my torture had altered my memories. In any case, 2 of the cops happened to be part of the search party that investigated the cave the night I escaped. Even if my story was a lie, it didn't matter so long as they found their missing girl in the cave. They asked me to help them find her. There were simply too many tunnels in the cave for them to find her on their own. But I refused outright. Nothing would bring me back to that cave. The thought of it triggered such a severe panic attack that they let me go without another word. Since then, I've readjusted to life, as best I can anyway. At first, food tasted sour, but for the most part, I've gotten used to it. I just take my steaks rare now. I found myself a lady too. She's decent and sweet, and she helps me forget about the times I suffered. She doesn't believe my story. I can sense in the tone of her voice whenever the subject comes up, but she knows better than to tease me. As for the missing girl, the police never told me if they found her. I haven't heard anything from them since they released me. I hope they did find her. I really do. But in the many years that have passed, it never once occurred me to find out. To tell you the truth, this is one story I don't want to see to the end. That one was quite long, wasn't it? 10 out of 10, good story. Thank you very much. This is going on to be a longer stream than I'd anticipated. I still have 2 more stories. Would you be ever so kind as to keep me company? I'll be here as long as you've got tales to tell. My. Well, as you can see from the books in the back, I've got many. Alright. I need to go check on my potion again. Please, again, don't touch anything. I'll be right back. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Those fumes are dangerous. Alright, let us continue. Next one. Interesting. Very interesting. I've got 2 more. This one is called In the Shadow of Mount Spire. We're getting lost in the mountains this time. Interesting. Sounds ominous. Very true. Oh my. Mount Spire shone brilliant and white above the bristly pines. In the noontime sun, one could see the snow weep and the summer trails reveal themselves. It was a wonderful sight for any climber. However, Anna would consider it even more wonderful if she did not have to hike 10 miles to actually get there. "Why didn't we just drive to the mountain?" she asked. Will and Carl chuckled. Their identical smirks mocked her for her laziness. "If you can't handle a leisurely stroll," Will said, "how can you climb the mountain?" his twin finished. They were perfect reflections of each other. Not an inch too tall, not a freckle out of place. They both behaved like sarcastic assholes. Luckily, Carl was always wore red, and Will always wore blue. That way, Anna could tell them apart. Despite the twins' attitude, the trail was rough and rocky, even for them. Their broad chests heaved, their faces flushed red, their thick curly beards dripped with sweat. And if the twins dripped with sweat, Rachel poured with it. She was a portly girl, and that was putting it lightly. However, she was Carl's wife and Anna's best friend. They couldn't exactly exclude her from the trip. Besides, what she lacked in physique, she made up for in spirit. Even as she gasped for air, Rachel managed a smile. "Don't worry, Anna," she said. "We'll make it." "That's not my concern," Anna said. She glared at the raging sun and then at the wrinkled map in her hands. The path they were wrapped around rugged countryside, tilting up and down, over and around. Surely they'd get to Mount Spire eventually. But at what time? "So what's the problem, princess?" Will said. She hated that nickname. In fact, she hated most things Will had to say. It was a shame. Will was handsome, and Anna was lonely. Once she wondered what it felt like to be in his embrace. Now even his voice repelled her. "Don't call me that," Anna said. She smacked him across the back of the head and shoved the map into his hands. "Look, this is the most winding and convoluted path to the mountain. There's no way we'll get there before nightfall." Will pushed the map back into her hands. "You look, there's no other path," he said. "If we don't make it, we'll stop and make camp. No big deal." "One day to the mountain, one day up the mountain, one day down, one day back. That was the plan," Anna said. The twin shrugged. "What's one more day?" Carl asked. Rachel cleared her throat. "In Anna's defense," she said, wiping the sweat from her eyes, "some of us need to go back to work." "Ah, so what? Take an extra day off. You need a breather from that boring state job," Will said. He punched Anna's shoulder. She punched him back harder. "Believe it or not, I don't like my boring state job." She did. Loved it, in fact. The job provided Anna with two of her favorite things. Two things Will knew nothing about. Order and routine. Did Will even have a job? Still, Anna wished her job offered time from more in life, like a relationship or a pet. Anna once wanted a relationship with Will, but not anymore. Rachel told her he had a cat with tiger stripes and golden eyes, but she couldn't date Will. A lot of characters, are we keeping up? Anna stopped and stared at the glittering peak of Mount Spire. Several miles of dense pine and gnarled oak separated them from their destination, but it was several miles fewer than the crooked path before them. "Why don't we just cut through the forest?" she asked. The twins stopped with a groan. Rachel bent over and took a well-needed break. She opened her canteen and guzzled down a mouthful of water. Ugh. "Ugh, I'm game for anything," she said, though she looked ready to pass out. "I'm not bushwhacking through that," Carl said, pointing into the woods. A cool breeze snaked through the trees. It smelled of moss and moist earth. As the group peered into the forest, the shadows shifted and trees groaned. Their branches shook and their leaves fell, one by one. Anna snorted. "I thought you two were all for adventure." Brown it, Carl extended his hand. "Give me the map," he said. As he studied the map, wrinkles stretched across his face. "Like it or not, Will, she might be onto something. It's only a couple miles through the forest, no rivers, incline is fairly steady." "How bad could it be?" Rachel said. She had finally caught her breath, but sweat still glistened on her face, and she wasn't the only one. The sun bore down on them without relent. If anything, they could use relief from the heat. "So what's the plan then? Just make our own path?" Will said. He looked around at the others. They said nothing. Instead, they answered with content smiles and subtle nods. So shaking his head and muttering to himself, Will stepped into the forest. Ooh. Sounds like a bad idea, Will. At once his mood improved. In fact, everyone's mood improved. The ground cushioned their steps, the shade cooled their skin, and the air was soft and fragrant. The hike was so pleasant, it didn't matter that they had to weave their way through the trees. It didn't matter that the sun was descending quick. It didn't matter that Mount Spire was no closer than when they had started. No one noticed. When the forest finally broke onto a wide, grassy field, evening was nearly upon them. Still, it didn't seem to bother anyone. "Not much we can do now," Carl said. "What's another day?" said his wife. "I guess we'll just camp here in the field," Will said. But Anna pushed forward. In the center of the field, in the shadow of Mount Spire, was a rickety old house. The last thing Anna expected was for someone to live here in the middle of nowhere with no path to civilization.
Maybe there are people inside,
she said.
Maybe they'll let us stay the night.
That's a little presumptuous, Carl said. Quite, his brother added. No lights shone in the battered home, no car stood out front, and as they approached the house's slanted porch, they heard nothing. By all accounts, the structure was still and dead.
Hello?
Anna called. She knocked on the door.
Hello?
There was no answer. Will shook his head. The place is abandoned, he said.
Doesn't mean we can't stay the night,
Anna said. She tried the door. It was unlocked. Overcome with curiosity, she stepped into the home. The floorboards creaked underfoot. Dust rose like smoke from fire. Behind her, the others followed along, not knowing why. They poked their heads around this corner and that and craned their necks to investigate every corner of the building. Truth be told, there wasn't much to look at. Ashes lay black in a fireplace covered in cobwebs. Books stood upright on a shelf, untouched for decades. Photos rested on the mantel with faces coated in a dense film. While the others investigated the rest of the house, Anna took one of the photos and wiped it on her shirt. She saw a wedding party. The bride and groom smiled with unmatched joy. They held each other close and looked only at each other. Their love was palpable. Anna wondered if she'd ever know love like that. She looked for Will, but he was gone. As Anna placed the photo back onto the mantel, she heard a scream from the other room. She rushed over and found her friend standing in a living room with two red armchairs. Seated in the chairs were two corpses. The man's flesh was pale and rotten. Bones shone pallid white where maggots had taken their fill. The woman looked marginally better. A rosy hue even clung to her cheeks. Otherwise, she was a mess of leathery skin and moth-bitten clothes. Flies crawled over her face and buzzed with delight. One look was enough. Anna turned away and covered her mouth, but the stubborn stench of death forced its way through her fingers. She could feel its putrid scent coat her tongue and choke her throat. Before she vomited on her shoes, Anna rushed outside and breathed in the fresh air. Rachel wasn't far behind.
This was a mistake,
Anna said. Oh, that's dreadful, Rachel said. Carl stood behind her with his arm around her shoulder. He kissed the top of her head, but she was numb to his touch. Those poor people, what happened to them? Isn't it obvious? They died, Will said, as a matter of fact. Although he carried the same smug smirk, and emptiness had taken hold of his eyes. His irises were dull and black and devoid of light. Clearly the bodies had shaken him too. Maybe Will was capable of being serious, even if only for a second.
In their chairs? At the same time?
Anna said. Rachel sighed from deep within her chest. Dreadful, she repeated. It doesn't matter, Carl said. We're not staying in that house tonight. It's not right. Everyone nodded, even Will. They were all in agreement, trying hard to erase the image of the dead from their minds. They pressed on. Daylight was thinning as it dropped below the trees. Soon it would be dark, and they'd yet to set up their tents or start a fire. We won't make it far. Night is coming, Will said. He pointed down a dirt road patched with some short tufts of grass. Here, just a little farther. Just as she started down the path, Anna stopped again. Goosebumps prickled along the back of her neck, and a chill sank into her bones. Despite the lingering summer heat, Anna began to shiver. She turned and looked back at the abandoned house. Still, the place was quiet and dead. A full minute passed before Anna moved. Though she could not say why, her eyes were fixated on the house. Before long, Rachel was beside her. Hey, are you alright? She asked. There's a clearing just down the path. We're setting up camp.
Yeah, I'm fine,
Anna said. She shook off her daze and followed Rachel down the path. All around them, the forest thickened. In the deepening twilight, the trees appeared as silhouettes with reaching black limbs. They trembled and sighed in the cool wind, and still, Anna shivered. At the end of the dirt road was a clearing, just as Rachel had said. It was a perfect circle of petrified earth. Not a single weed nor blade of grass touched the clearing. Even the trees bent away in fear. No living thing dared enter the circle, except for Anna and her friends. While Carl set up tents, Will arranged a pile of firewood into a teepee. None seemed to notice the stone pedestal at the center of the clearing. What's that? Anna asked. She walked towards the pedestal. Resting on top was a triangular lattice of woven thorns and crimson leaves. Without thinking, she reached out and grabbed it. One of the thorns pricked her finger and drew blood. Ow, she said, and dropped the lattice work. Careful, princess, Will said. He plucked the lattice work from the ground and gave it a quick look. The prism of thorns didn't interest him in the slightest. He said. Looks like a kindling to me. He chucked the lattice work into the pile of firewood without a care or thought. Bad move, Will, bad move.
Hey,
Anna said.
Someone took time to make that.
Carl snorted. And what, you're gonna bring it up Mount Spire with you? Anna scowled. No,
But it was clearly on that pedestal for a reason.
What reason? Will said. He took out a lighter and lit the lattice work. In an instant, the thorn and leaves caught fire. It snapped and hissed with dense black smoke. Anna reached out to stop him, but it was too late. What's the matter? Everyone here is dead. No one's gonna get mad. Rachel rubbed her back. Don't worry, look, she said. In Rachel's hand was a bottle of whiskey. By the goofy grin on her face, it was clear she'd already had a swig. Anna looked at her friend and then at the bottle. A similar smile appeared on her face. She always knew how to lighten the mood. In time, Anna forgot about the latticework and the pedestal. She forgot about the corpses in their decrepit home. She forgot most everything, in fact. All that mattered was the company of friends and the pleasant tingle of alcohol seeping into her veins. They talked and laughed and danced around the crackling fire until the cratered moon hung high in the sky. The heads spun and the voices carried loud and far. It was the type of night they'd planned for. Anna wouldn't trade it for anything, though perhaps she would have, if she knew what was coming. Sometime before midnight, the joyful buzz of whiskey gave way to a deep lethargy. One by one, they disappeared into their tents. First Rachel, then Carl soon after, then Will, and finally Anna. But sleep didn't come easily. As Anna lay down in her tent, her heartbeat pounded through her temples. It thrummed from ear to ear like drums rolling in the deep. Anna cursed herself for drinking too much and sat up with a groan. Yet, as soon as she did, the sound vanished. Confused, she lay down again. The heartbeat reappeared. She pushed her pillow aside and set her head against the ground. Now the noise grew clearer. It sounded of blood whooshing and ventrals throbbing faster and faster. Outside, the dirt stirred and a shadow slunk. Anna watched the figure creep up and down the line of tents. It lay low to the ground like an injured animal, but it did not growl, or groan, or whimper. The only sound was the rustle of its body scraping against the earth. For several minutes, Anna listened, certain that at any second the creature would burst into her tent. She waited anxiously as the ground still thrummed beneath her. All the while, her eyes darted around the tent and searched for something to defend herself with. But there was nothing. After what seemed like an hour, the rustling stopped and the figure disappeared. Cautiously, Anna unzipped her tent and poked her head outside. She saw nothing but the stone pedestal standing pale in the moonlight. She stepped outside and scanned the area. Still, she saw only the barren clearing. But before she could return to her tent, something caught Anna by the ankle. She shrieked in surprise, and then again when she saw what had grabbed her. 5 inky fingers wrapped around her leg. The skin was cold and tattered, but the flesh was pure shadow. Attached to the hand was a skeletal man, black in shade. His face was smooth, except for 2 pits where eyes should have been. Screaming to the bottom of her lungs, Anna kicked the ghoulish creature. It released her at once, but as it did, a vertical slit divided its face and peeled back, revealing a bottomless maw. A chilling moan echoed from its throat, and the ground rumbled. Awakened by the sound, Rachel bolted from her tent. She saw the ghoul lying on the ground and immediately burst into a horrifying scream. As if called by her fear, a second creature emerged from the earth. It leapt onto Rachel and knocked her down with ease. Carl ran out of the tent, but he was too late. The ghoul drove its dusky fingers into Rachel's sternum and split her chest in 2. Blood sprayed like black jewels glistening beneath the stars. While Carl stood helpless, Rachel moaned in agony. The ghoul grabbed a hold of her twitching heart and burrowed into her gaping cavity. As soon as it did, the monster vanished, and a second shadow figure emerged from Rachel's mouth. A although it resembled the ghoul, this figure was thin as smoke and screamed in a shrill, scared voice. Rachel's voice. Just then, a hole opened in the earth. Though she dug her fingers into the ground, Rachel was drawn into the hole. Carl reached out to grab her, but a black hand caught him and pulled him back. As her feet slipped into the hole, more ghouls surfaced. They clambered over her, pushing her down, suffocating her. And in an instant, Rachel was gone. While two creatures wrestled Carl to the ground, Rachel's body repaired itself. Its ribs snapped into place, and its skin sealed shut. Hollow-eyed and without expression, the body stood and walked into the forest. "What the hell is going on?" Will said. Immediately he saw his brother struggling beneath two faceless creatures. "Carl!" He sprinted to help his brother while Anna backed away from the campsite with horror and disbelief. "No! No!" Carl screamed. One creature held him down while the other latched onto its teeth and wrenched apart his mouth. Thrashing on the ground, Carl wailed. His jaw hung limp and blood poured down his throat, choking him. Will grabbed one of the ghouls and pulled it off his brother, but the other forced its way down Carl's throat. And just as it disappeared into his body, another spirit shot outward. Once more, the ground opened and swallowed the ghostly figure. "We have to get out of here," Anna said to Will. More ghouls emerged from below. One after another, they crawled into the night, their eyeless faces searching for prey. Before long, there were too many to count and too many to fight. They had to run. "Will!" But Will stared in shock as his brother's body stood and walked into the distance, unconcerned for the creatures around them. Will could not hear and could not move. Fear had paralyzed him. But Anna wouldn't let it paralyze her. She turned and ran, her breath throbbed in her chest. This could not be happening. A dream! A dream! Please, let it be a dream, because no dream is so vivid and violent. Anna made it a few paces from the tent before she fell over a large dark object. It was one of the ghouls. Immediately, it crawled on top of her. Anna kicked and squirmed, but the creature held hold of her with its icy black hands. It yanked her by the leg and pulled itself on top of her. Unable to move, Anna stared helplessly as the creature's face split down the middle and its hands hung menacingly over her chest. Before the creature could plunge its hands into her flesh, Will grabbed the ghoul by the neck and tore it off her. "Go, get out of here," he screamed. "Run!" As he wrestled the creature to the ground, it turned on him. Blood dripped from Will's neck as the ghoul drove its crooked nails into his throat. He suffered the pain with gritted teeth and struggled desperately to free himself. Anna stepped forward to help, but Will shook his head. "Go!" he said, and managed to smile. It was a charming smile, one she wished to see more often, and one she knew she would never see again. Just then a second ghoul leapt on Will's back, then a third, and then a fourth. They ripped through his flesh and severed his spine. Screaming, Will felt his muscle give out and his body go numb. The ghouls pushed each other away, fighting over Will's limp body. Anna didn't see which creature won control of his body, but she couldn't watch any longer. Whatever they were coming for her. Hundreds of them. They poured over the clearing like a throbbing mass of rats hungering for the taste of blood. Well, that's just rude. Uncertain where to go or what to do, Anna retreated back to the house. She shut the door and locked it behind her. Her lungs throbbed. Her heart was in her ears. Or was it in the earth? The stubborn beating resounded through her feet. building, echoing, louder and louder until it roared between her ears. Groaning, Anna stumbled into the living room where the two corpses sat in their armchairs. Except there was only one corpse. The man, half eaten by time, sat slumped in his chair. His wife was nowhere to be seen. The floorboards creaked as Anna approached the armchairs. In the corpse's lap was a pistol, and in his head, a bullet hole. Between the two armchairs was a coffee table with a note on it. The wrinkled paper was stained with blood. Clotted blood. Glancing around, Anna took the note and read it in a soft, trembling murmur.
Forgive me. We have dabbled in arts we do not understand. We have delved too deep and found something we could not bury. They have escaped already. They walk among us. I could only seal the door. Do not touch the artifact. Forsake these lands and leave me to rot. My wife comes for me. Forgive me, dear. I know not what hell you have fallen to, but surely I will see you there.
The artifact. He must have meant the lattice. But they burned it. They released the ghouls and now there was no putting them back. Anna heard the floorboards groan behind her. She whirled around and stood face to face with the wife. The woman's eyes were flat and apathetic. Without a word or even a grunt, she punched Anna in the face. The blow knocked her out cold. When Anna woke, her arms were bound in rope and she was being dragged across the floor. Above her, the stars twinkled sadly like 1,000 eyes welling with tears. Anna struggled to see where she was being taken, but she already knew. She was back in the clearing.
No, please,
Anna begged, though she knew it was hopeless. The woman dragging her did not care. There was no humanity inside her, no feelings to appeal to. Anna's fate was sealed, but she pleaded regardless because there was nothing else she could do.
Please, someone!
When they had reached the pedestal at the center of the clearing, the woman dropped her. All around them, the ground shook. Anna heard the horrid call of the ghouls and the incessant beating of heart. Holes appeared in the dirt as the ghouls clawed their ways to the surface. Anna screamed, but her captor turned and disappeared into the forest without so much as a backward glance. The first ghoul seized Anna by the hair. It pulled back her head and dug its claws into her eyes. Anna shrieked as the world went black. A second ghoul grabbed her leg and wrenched it from its socket. Muscle and sinew ripped. Blood gushed outward. A third ghoul stabbed through her chest, piercing her lungs. Pain filled her chest like an unrelenting fire, and her breath caught in her throat, clogged with gore. As the creatures tore through her body, time slowed from seconds to hours, and she was aware, painfully aware, of every agonizing moment. Soon she begged not for help, but for the sweet relief of death. But what she got was not death, not as she imagined it. When at last one of the ghouls gripped her heart, Anna felt her consciousness shift out of her body. And for a moment, her vision returned to her. She saw her body splayed open before her, ribs shattered, skin shredded. Nonetheless, the body stood. Its flesh mended and its wounds healed quickly. Before long, Anna's body was whole again. The only thing it was missing was Anna itself, herself. With spectral fingers, Anna reached out for her body, but something pulled her back, an invisible force she could not resist. She dug her nails into the ground, but her limbs were weak and thin as gossamer. She cried and spit, but the ghouls scrambled over. They pushed her into the dirt until the cold soil rose above her waist. Hope had already vanished. Anna saw her body fade into the twisted oaks and bristly pines of the forest beyond. Whatever awaited her below, there was no escaping it now. Anna breathed deep and succumbed to her fate. As the earth swallowed her neck, she took one last look at the world above. Just 2 yards off, she saw the remains of their fire. Somewhere buried in the black coals, the artifact still smoldered with a pitiful white light. Anna had only a moment to feel regret. Then, the earth consumed her. She only saw darkness. She felt only pain. She suffocated amid an undulating horde with 1,000 voices crying out. Each man and every woman clawed and fought, struggling to reach the top of an ocean with no surface. And all around was the deafening boom of a tortured heart. Well, that one was a bit gory. Whew. Very gory. Good still, thank you. Alright, my voice grows weary. But one more. Just one. Are you ready for the last story? It will be the last one before you have to be on your way. Mustn't stay too long in a witch's lair. Now, the very last story is called Those Deep, Dark Wells. Huh. Interesting. Are you ready? The terrible thing happened at night, as most terrible things do. While I clicked away at my home job as a transcriptionist, I often watched the boys playing in the backyard. They'd be at it for hours, acting out some scene with foam swords and plastic guns, only stopping when the sun left to rise somewhere else. Seeing Mason happy made me happy. He had finally found a friend. Mason. Familiar name. His father left us when he was 6 months old, and more or less held no role in his life. Sure, there were some occasional visits every few years, but even those were short and feigned, not even so much as an annual birthday card. Perhaps that was why Mason anchored himself such a secure distance from other kids, a point driven home by his 5th grade teacher and several others. Part of me didn't blame him. Kids in school, especially the ones I can recall, weren't the friendliest bunch. If you were lucky, you could pick out the sharks from the minnows and avoid them, but honestly, they all looked the same, twined together in the same concrete box. Please give him a best friend, I whisper at my bedside every night, sending out the same message to God, or at least to something just as benevolent, to hear my prayer. Give my son his first best friend. Then one day, much to my wonderment, Mason brought Todd home for a playdate. He was a petite boy with mismatched clothes, unkempt hair, and the bluest eyes you'd ever seen. I was ecstatic, relieved that my son had finally cracked open his shell and found a buddy.
I saw him at the park.
Mason told me when I asked how they had met.
He was sitting alone at the swings, like he was sad. When he saw me on my bike, he waved, and I waved back. Then we hung out, and he was really cool.
As he shared this, I couldn't help but smile in his excitement. So much deserved by the loneliest boy in the world. That night, they had a sleepover and passed out in the living room. From my bedroom, I could hear the muffled speech of our television, which they had left on. Sighing, I untucked myself out of bed and walked sluggishly down the stairs to them. Light from the screen pulsed and stretched over the sleeping boys. Mason was swaddled in his blanket on the floor, while Todd was curled up on the couch. I scanned for the remote, and after no luck, I moved to shut it off myself. A lone bag of chips crinkled under my foot. From the couch, Todd's shape twitched and then bolted upright. I meant to say sorry, but I was stopped short. When Todd jutted awake and opened his eyes, I couldn't see them. They hadn't rolled up in their sockets or slipped to their sides. They were simply gone. 2 holes of singular darkness. Todd had blue eyes, vividly blue eyes, but at that instant not even the glow of the television reflected off those dark membranes, black as Santa's skull. Then he blinked, and the eyes returned. Before I could say anything, his mouth stretched into a yawn, and his body slumped back into the cushions. Before I could say anything, he was fast asleep. I was stiff as a board, somewhat relieved I hadn't shrieked and woken them both up. My thoughts told me it was a trick of the light, as did any speck of reason. Vision played games with you that way. I switched off the television and went back to bed. A few weeks later, on an especially windy night, a knock came at the door. Todd was there, as usual, seesawing on his soles patiently. "Hi there," I smiled.
Hi.
He smiled, his thin neck cropped.
Can Mason come out and play?
Before I had even had to answer, Mason had already squeezed past me, still working one of his arms through his jacket sleeve.
Bye, Mum.
I watched as they disappeared down the street. The rule was to be back before dark, and to their credit, the boys always returned just as the sky started to dim. On that particular outing, they came home with some cool rocks they'd found and dirt-clotted sneakers. By the time Todd was ready to walk back home, it had fallen too dark for him to go alone. I gave him a ride, with both boys in the back seat. It wasn't a far drive, as his house was only a few streets away. Every so often, my eyes would slip back to the rear view and see Todd watching the street, Mason dozing off next to him. As we passed beneath the street lamps, a bar of light would creep through the window, roll over his face, and vanish over his head. The car suddenly rocked as my wheels rolled too hastily over a speed bump. His gaze left the window and met mine, only this time, as the slanted light skimmed over his features, blue eyes did not look back at me. They were gone, blotted out by the same oily darkness, silent, murky circles. Even his skin, in just that quick moment, looked different, like dry, mottled clay fit poorly over a skull. Lips bloodlessly shriveled. I slammed on the brake, jostling all of us with a sudden lurch. Mason gasped himself into a wide-eye awareness. As fast as it had happened, the straight-faced horror in my backseat returned to a sweet young boy, shocked and surprised. "Sorry," I breathed. "Sorry about that, guys. I thought I saw a cat in the road." As we reached Todd's house, a white ranch style with a flowering dogwood tree in the front yard, the boys said their goodbyes. I could only stare into the dashboard, my heart sending tremors down my arm. The world felt off its tilt, and as if the lines separating actuality and nonsense were blurred. I was disoriented by how real it all seemed. His eyes, like deep dark wells, his unhealthy skin stretched and pulled like a death mask. My thoughts clashed with the fold of my brain that formed logic, and eventually, logic won. It was all in my head. Period. But despite how far-fetched it sounded, I actively avoided eye contact with Todd, not even giving a sliver of opportunity for that oily pitch to return. If it even happened in passing glance or a quick double take, I'd be back to circling the rim of a mental collapse. A week later, I went to pick up Mason from Todd's house. I pulled up along the curb, texted, "I'm here," and waited there for some time. There was no sign he read my message, nor did he answer any of my calls. When I got tired of waiting, I twisted the keys out of the ignition and made my way up the slim walkway. The house was missing a great deal of shingles, which scarred its roofline in dark patches. The rain gutters were clogged and stunk of decomposing leaves. I knocked briskly and waited. The door unlocked, held only partially open by a door chain.
"Yes?"
The face peeking out asked. His voice was nasally, like it was lodged somewhere in his throat, right in the pit of it. "Hi, I'm Holly, Mason's mum, here to pick him up." The door closed and then opened fully as the chain slid out of its holder. The man on the other end was lanky, with onset baldness widening his forehead, his eyes tired and heavy.
"Oh, sorry about that,"
he said, flashing a thin-lipped smile and offering a handshake.
"David, the boys are still probably on their way back, but they'll be here any minute now. You can come inside and wait if you'd like. I've got some tea ready to go."
I took him up on the offer and followed him inside. At our immediate right was the living area, where a woman sat watching a rom-com on the television. Paying no mind to the sound at the door, she kept her back to us. Beneath the show's timed laugh track, I could hear the sound of a hard, labored breathing. Hanging over the side of the sofa drooped a thin, skeletal wrist. On the wall, a grey Kit Kat clock shifted its eyes and wagged its tail. The kitchen was small, with a triangular arrangement of sink, stove, and refrigerator, a small dance between the three. Flowery wallpaper looped around the room, a formica-topped table sat against the wall with minty green chairs. I took a seat in one as David retrieved some cups from the cabinet. The smell of light orchid drifted through the air.
"Hope you like green tea,"
he said quietly as he filled the cups and brought them over. "Green is fine," I replied, taking the cup from him. "Thank you." He planted himself a chair.
"They're really fond of each other, aren't they? The boys, I mean."
"I'd say so. You can hardly keep Mason away." I laughed. By this point, I'd noticed the dark pouches under his eyes more clearly. In fact, his overall appearance seemed to be hanging in a mournful sag. Whatever supplement he needed, he was missing a lot of it. "So, how long have you been in the neighborhood?" I asked for the sake of conversation.
"Oh, a good while now,"
he mused, rubbing a finger along his cup. "Really? I'm surprised Mason didn't meet Todd sooner. Our houses aren't too far from each other."
"Todd?"
he asked, as though needing a moment to remember his own son's name.
"Oh, yes, that is pretty surprising. He, gets around."
"Mason never sees him at school. Does he go to a different district?" Lines creased his mouth.
"School? Well, we..."
From the other room, a harsh, guttural coughing reached us. David's neck swiveled towards the sound.
"Excuse me. My wife needs me."
He left his chair and hastily went to her. Not too long after that, the front door opened as Todd and Mason arrived. As we said our goodbyes to David and his silent wife, he clasped my hand in a tight shake.
"It was nice meeting you, Holly. Really, it was."
When he released his grip, I realized something was left in my palm. When we were back in the car, I folded it open. "What's that?"
"What's that, Mom?"
"Nothing, sweetie," I smiled back at him, placing the crumpled note in my lap. A phone number, a time to call, and the word help scribbled into its loose leaf. It was nightfall when I unfurled and read it again. I was in the backyard, occupying a seat at our fire pit, my cell phone in one hand and a cigarette pinched in the other. The note said to call at 8, which was only 5 minutes away. As the time drew closer, my chest tightened with anxiousness. Moments ago, I'd snuck into my own room, pulled out the bottom shelf of my dresser, and unearthed the pack of Marlboros hidden there. 3 years I've been without them, and 3 years I'd kept my promise to Mason to stop smelling like an ashtray. But tonight, shamefully, they were the only things holding me together. When the clock on my phone pulsed 8, I took a long drag on the cigarette and dialed the number. The tone chipped in and out a few times and finally connected.
"Hello?
David's voice chattered on the other end.
Who is this right now?"
My heart rattled in my throat. "It's Holly, Mason's mum." The voice exhaled and returned briskly.
"I need you to listen to me. Okay? Are you listening?
"Yes, I'm listening."
Keep it away from your boy.
The fire pit popped and spat a few embers. Keep what away? What are you talking about?
Listen,
He snapped, a manic weight to his words.
don't let Mason come over here anymore. It isn't safe for him. Don't even let it go over there. You have to stop this now.
I twisted my neck back towards the house and leaned forward in my chair. Are we talking about your son right now?
Isn't my son!
He scorned.
Not at all. Not in any way.
You need to calm down. If you need help, I can call the police.
No, police!
He screamed. His voice so tight and stressed that it splintered on the other end.
It will take more from her if you do that. My wife, she can't handle much more. It's taking something from her, taking something from me. We can't get rid of it now. It's too late for us, but not for you. You can stop this.
He started to weep and muttered to himself.
He came to our door to use the phone. Why did we let it in? Why did we let it use the fucking phone?
Something stirred in its background. He paused and whispered.
Keep it away from him.
And then he hung up. I'm not sure how long I sat out there, but it was long enough for the flames to shrink into powdery mounds. When I entered the house again, Mason was on the couch with his tablet.
You smell weird.
He said, taking note of me. The fire pit, I lied. My thoughts too heavy to muster anything else. He flashed me a big smile and tactfully asked,
Can I have a sleepover at Todd's this weekend?
No, I answered stiffly. That isn't going to work.
Why not?
He persisted.
Todd always sleeps over here. Why can't we do his?
Because, Mason, I said no. End of story. He shot an icy look of defiance at me.
Fine, then he'll sleep over here then.
No, he won't. We are going to take a break from Todd for a while. His jaw opened, flabbergasted.
You can't do that.
I just did, I said, perhaps a little too matter-of-factly. As I walked back up the stairs, I could feel the burn of his eyes watching me on every step, both of our nights now ruined. David's deranged garble on the phone sat with me for the rest of the night. I had no idea what to do, what to fix, what to think. Keep it away. It isn't safe for him. The message so vague, but also desperately clear. I had to keep Mason safe. That was all that mattered. The next day after Mason was back from school, I sat him down on the couch. I'm sorry for last night, I said. I was very stressed, but that is not the way I want us to speak to each other again, okay? His eyes naturally scanned the floor.
Okay.
I love you, Mason, and no matter what, I want to keep you safe, so here are a few things I need to know about Todd. Will you do that for me? He nodded again, his sneakers softly kicking the backpack slumped on the carpet. Did he ever act weird or strange to you? His head shook. What about his parents? Did he act different around them? Same answer. I wasn't sure how to word the next question, but I did my best anyway. Did he ever do something with his eyes? This time, Mason nodded. My heart squeezed itself smaller. I wanted so much to change the subject, to retreat to the kind cadence of sanity, but I had to know more. I had to protect my son. What did he do with his eyes?
A trick.
Mason replied hesitantly.
Told me not to tell anyone though.
You have to tell me. His lips crinkled, trying to keep the secret zipped up. Then he finally spoke.
He could make them disappear.
I felt drugged by his words, my head feeling even lighter, like all the logic in the world had been raptured away. You did see them, my thoughts repeated. You did see the deep, dark wells. As quickly as all my self-doubt left, a scream of dread filled the empty spaces. Did it scare you? I asked.
A little.
Mason replied absently.
He said not to be, though, that he'd show me how to do it too.
I grabbed his shoulder, making him jump suddenly. He didn't though, right? He didn't do anything to you.
He looked confused, like I was the only one talking crazy now.
No. I know he's your friend, Mason, but I need you to promise me that you won't see him again.
Mason's gaze flickered back to mine, his eyes wide with betrayal. What?
Tears began to come down. Promise me, I repeated, the words like razors scraping down my tongue. I don't want to! Mason! After much hesitation, he tearfully replied.
I promise.
I hugged him, closed my eyes, and surrendered to the cruelty of it all. For the rest of that hellish week, I kept my ears tuned for the knock at the door. For whatever reason, Todd never used the doorbell. Inevitably, the knock came. Behind the frosted glass of our front door, I could see Todd's vague shape teetering on its soles. When the door opened, he smiled up at me.
Hi. Can Mason come out and play?
Sorry, dear, I smiled back. Mason can't play today. The corner of his mouth lifted as his neck cocked to the side.
Can he later?
No, I don't think so. Sorry. His nose wrinkled and the skin between his eyebrows creased.
Okay.
I closed the door, watched him leave, and that was that. Might take a few times, but eventually the message would sink in. Leave my son alone. I felt a sense of pride behind that, and what could possibly be better protect a boy than his mother? But when I turned and saw Mason's cold eyes from the stairs, the pride all but evaporated. When Todd returned the next day, I gave him the same answer. Then the day after that, and the one after that. I couldn't even refuse to answer when he knocked. Otherwise, he'd sit there and wait. Knock again and wait some more, knowing full well we were home. 4 straight evenings of it. And poor Mason, he had every right to despise me for this. No parent could want to war themselves between their son and their best friend, his first friend. But what choice did I have? We were drifting apart, orbiting ever farther away from one another. He was my prisoner, and I was the judge, sentencing him back to a lonely world. Surely he'd make new friends, right? The world was full of them, and if anything, this was proof that he could find them. That thought helped me cope anyway. When the knock came for the 5th time in a row, my tolerance had run out. Todd wasn't catching on, and to make matters more irritating, it was 8 or so at night this time. Part of me hoped it was someone else. Maybe a neighbor bringing a package by that was wrongfully left on their doorstep, but I knew better than that. And I was not allowing this to go any further. Mason was doing his homework at the kitchen table when I passed him, no acknowledgement whatsoever. When I opened the door, Todd was standing there beneath our porch light, both shoulders hunched over his ears as though expecting me to smack him, and perhaps verbally, that's what I did. Go home, I said assertively. We're done. No more of this, all right?
Can Mason come out to play?
He asked sorrowfully, as though it weren't after dark. No, Todd, he can't, and he won't the next day or the next. Now go home and stay there. His small arm rubbed his sleeve nervously.
It's really dark. I don't want to walk home alone. Can I use your phone to call my parents?
I felt absolutely cruel, but I knew the game he was trying to play. You walked here on your own, you can walk back on your own. Then, as I moved to close the door and end the conversation, Todd made his eyes disappear. The darkness washed over them quickly and seemed actually to curdle in his sockets. A thickening, horrible texture. His face became milk wax, the sad child disappearing behind it. Beads of perhaps sweat dripped from his temples. One ran into his eye and vanished into the void.
I want to come inside.
He spoke, the sorrowful note in his voice also gone. My heart slackened to a deep, slow throb. I felt the need to pinch my side, to tweak it hard enough to draw blood and wake from this moment. Between the dead, shriveled lips, I could see the decaying tips of black teeth.
Can I please come inside?
No, I said, semi-reactively. His black, craving eyes narrowed at me. For a moment, I actually thought they started to cry, but it was the darkness dribbling down his face.
I just want to play with Mason.
The sound of it, the sound of that horrible face saying my son's name, snapped me out of the shock. I slammed the door closed and quickly locked it. Mason stood stiffly in the kitchen. His expression was only a shimmer of consciousness, vacant as a sleepwalker. Mason, look at me. Honey, it's all right. Everything's gonna be okay. But his unfocused eyes were not facing me. 3 firm knocks came from the door. When I turned to face it, a dark shape lingered behind the frosted glass. A tall figure, taller than any adult, was hunching to look inside, and from behind the single pane that separated us, its vague shape didn't move. From the other side, Todd's childish voice was still calling.
Can I please come inside? Don't you want to play, Mason? Don't you want to play?
I could feel it watching us, like static vibrating the air. When I tried to move Mason, he refused to budge, staring emptily towards the evil thing behind the glass. Heavy as it was, I scooped him up in my arms and bolted for the stairs. It won't break in, my thoughts uttered. It isn't allowed to. That much I was sure of. If it wanted to get in, it would have by now. It needed to be invited. I shut both of us away into the bathroom upstairs, and when the sounds of the front door finally ceased, Mason snapped out of it. He was confused, like he had just missed everything that transpired. I wasn't sure whether to consider that was a blessing or not. Perhaps it was, and perhaps also it was not God that answered my prayer. It was almost impossible to digest what had happened that night. Sometimes I linger on the stairs right on the top step and watch the doorway, wondering if the glass would suddenly darken, if Todd's voice would slip through and ask to come inside. One night, David had left a voicemail on my phone.
She's gone.
His voice whimpered.
It got what it wanted from her. Drained her dry. Now my wife won't wake up and it's left us. I don't know what it wants from your body, but it wants something. No matter what, do not let it back inside.
The message cut out after that, and he still won't answer my calls. Todd never did come back, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Strangely enough, the one least affected by all of this was Mason. I was worried to see him fall back into that distant bubble, but that isn't what happened. He started making friends with other kids around the neighborhood. New friends. Normal friends. He'd really become a social butterfly, and despite my brain ripping itself apart to understand what I'd seen, I at least had that comfort to cling to. Seeing Mason made me happy. Lately, though, I've been feeling strange. It's been harder to feel motivated about things, let alone get out of bed in the morning. Even my appetite has started to dwindle. Day by day, I've been growing increasingly sapped and lethargic. I don't know what's wrong, but it's getting worse. Mason's been helping me around the house, even going out of his way to play chef and make me things to eat. He's a good boy, but sometimes, dear Lord, I catch something in his eyes, something that shouldn't be there. But it's only a trick of the light. Please, God, let it only be a trick of the light. And that's that. What an ending. Hold on, I'll be right back. Since it was the third time, I didn't think you'd need another reminder. No touching. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this year's Halloween horror story time. Was it enjoyable? Some of these stories were a lot longer than last year's, I will give it that. But I did enjoy telling stories for you guys. That's good. Now, it's best you be on your way. Can't have you being stuck forever in a witch's lair. It's not suitable for humans. Now, just another reminder, there is the premiere that happened. Do check that out. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.